Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now, find yourself a comfortable spot, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features The Bride and the Wanderer by Bella Brown, all rights reserved. Chapter 1. Katelyn, I think it's time that we discussed your future. Katelyn Scott looked up from the book she was reading. She was comfortably ensconced in the yellow velvet chair in the library. The fire simmered in the hearth, her mother's spoiled gray cat stretching out on the expensive oriental rug in front of it. At some point, since she'd sat down, the sun had vanished out of the sky, and a soft spring drizzle trickled down the window pane. The last thing she wanted to do was put the book down, let alone have an unwanted discussion with her mother about what was almost certainly going to be about her marriage prospects. She much preferred diving into the adventures of others than to figure out what her future held. But Aura Drysdale was like a terrier, determined and bothersome over the issue of her single daughter. Now, I'm a little busy. Aura's thin brow arched disdainfully, her blue eyes pointedly taking in the book in Katelyn's hand. You look it, my dear. Katelyn tried again, missing the days when her mother was too busy spending the family fortune to bother with her. Can we discuss it tomorrow? Tomorrow. You'll tell me you want to talk the next day, and then the day after that, and then the day after that. The newly made Mrs. Drysdale stubbornly sat down in the chair across from Katelyn. I won't be put off any longer. Begrudgingly, Katelyn slipped a piece of ribbon into the book and closed the cover. So I see. Katelyn, you will not take the snippy tone with me. This is very important, and anyone else your age would be much more comfortable knowing what the future holds, Mrs. Drysdale lectured, arranging the folds of her stunning navy skirts over her knees. Katelyn pressed her lips together, wishing she knew the right way to respond. Her mother hadn't exactly been a shining example of planning for the future, not after her husband died. Shortly after Mr. Scott had been laid to rest, Katelyn's mother had proceeded to spend every cent he'd ever made. Dresses, hats, fine china, imported carpets, racing horses that were so wild they couldn't even be handled except by the best of grooms, who also happened to charge the earth. It was only the utter destitution that she'd driven them into, which had made her change her name from Mrs. Scott to Mrs. Drysdale. Mother, everyone else my age is already married. I am the last stronghold, holding out for someone who doesn't bore me to tears. Mrs. Drysdale fixed her child with a withering look. Honestly, Katelyn, you make it difficult to love you at all sometimes. Must you always be so contrary? Katelyn bit back a sigh and rolled her hand through the air in front of her, indicating that she was listening. Her mother adjusted herself in the chair, her dainty hands linking in her lap. There are several young men that your stepfather, Katelyn corrected. Her mother's face pinched with irritation, but she continued. There are several men in town who would be good suitors for you. Would these the tedious ones I was made to dance with last week, or the nauseating ones who dined here the week before that? Katelyn replied flippantly. It wasn't that she needed her husband to be particularly exciting or brilliant. She simply wanted someone to love, and she hadn't seen the potential for that in any of the men who'd come to the various social engagements the Drysdales were constantly hosting or being invited to. That tongue of yours isn't going to get you any of them if you keep this up, Mrs. Drysdale warned. The real heart of the matter here isn't about who you marry anyway. No? Katelyn questioned, a dark brow quirked. Her mother was up to something. She thought her 7%. She thought herself clever, that she could get others to do what she wanted without them knowing. Anytime Katelyn spoke to her, especially lately, she knew to be cautious. No, not exactly. Mrs. Drysdale straightened herself in her seat and squared her shoulders. Your father left you a sum of money when he passed away. If Katelyn had been on guard before, she knew she had to be even more vigilant now. That's correct. She'd been careful, hardly touching any of it thus far. She hadn't needed to while she still lived with her mother, who was more than happy to spend her new husband's money. I've just been thinking that whoever does get lumbered with you will be after that money as his own. You wouldn't want something to happen to it. After all, you'll want that to fall back on should you have some sort of setback, her mother went on. Katelyn lifted her chin, the book completely forgotten now. I've considered this, and I like to think that I'll find myself a husband who will respect me and my wishes. Ora laughed, as if her daughter had told the most hilarious joke. Goodness me, how idealistic you can be. It's a lovely thought, dear, but I'm not sure it's based in reality. She leaned forward and tipped her chin down, giving her daughter a serious look. What you need to do is to give the money to me for safekeeping. That way you know where it'll be. Katelyn carefully schooled her face as her temper simmered just beneath the surface. Oh yes, she knew precisely where it would be. Some of it would be at the milliner, and some at the cabinet maker's, and certainly plenty would be with her mother's dressmaker. Katelyn could guess that there would be plenty of other places her mother would spend it too, all in the name of safekeeping. As much as she reviled her mother for her financial habits, she didn't want to anger her to the point of doing anything drastic. I appreciate your concerns, but I have it all well in hand. Do you? Her mother demanded. Are you telling me you have plans for your future besides sitting around and reading books? Katelyn tried to remain calm under the pernicious stare that was coming at her from across the room. That's correct. Well, what are these plans that I'm only just hearing about? Mrs. Drysdale's hand curled into a fist, her ring glittering as she pounded it against her knee. You haven't heard about it because I didn't want to announce anything until everything is finalized. You'll simply have to be patient for a little while longer. Now, if you'll excuse me. Katelyn rose. She left her book on the side table and swept from the room, not giving her mother a further chance to question her. She unlocked her desk and pulled the letter out from the little cubby in the back, where it had been hidden amongst other correspondence so as not to seem special. To her, however, it was more than special. It was her ticket out of this life, away from her mother and her odorous new husband, and far from anyone who wanted to use her for her money. Katelyn sat down and held the envelope for a while. It traveled very far to get here. Its final journey was when the cook was discreet enough to hand it to Katelyn while nobody else was around. She'd already read it several times, but now she took it out and read it once again. Miss Scott, I'm in receipt of your latest letter, and it pleases me that we might make an agreement that benefits both parties. To reiterate, I'm looking for a woman strong enough to stand at my side. I want children to whom I can pass my family's ranch down to, and to take care of me in my autumn years. My life has been dedicated to work, and I feel that now is the time to find a wife. Healing. I may no longer be a young man, but I know that I would make a good husband. If all of this is agreeable to you, then I look forward to your arrival in Parkstown. R. Nash. She pulled in a deep breath as she folded the letter back into the envelope. She'd not replied before now because whilst the offer of a calm and sedate existence on a ranch sounded appealing, it wasn't quite the declarations of love from a man that she'd always dreamt of. The kind that she read about on the moors of England, where she would get swept off her feet in a torrent of obsession. Robson Nash had admitted that he was neither young nor a handsome man. He didn't have anything particular to offer, other than the hard work of a mother and wife on a ranch. Katelyn, though, prided herself on being a practical person. Her parents had loved one another, but they'd also maintained a house and a social standing. A united front, even if Katelyn had heard the quarreling behind closed doors. She'd grown up knowing that love wasn't always extravagant overtures and passion. It was also a union of two people who built a life together. Besides, a rancher out west surely beat one of Drysdale's dull friends any day of the week. At least this way was a chance to choose someone for herself, to have at least a little bit of control over her future. Life with Robson sounded composed and steady, a welcome respite from the day-long shopping sprees and all-night rants of her mother. Perhaps it was not ideal, but it was most certainly a welcome change. Ensuring that her bedroom door was locked, Katelyn took out her pen and inkwell and composed her reply. Chapter 2. Katelyn watched the scenery go by. The landscape had changed so many times since she'd left Rhode Island. Large cities rose and fell, the long stretches in between them dotted by smaller towns, hills, and farm fields. She tried to keep track of exactly where they were, but with so many stops in so many unfamiliar places, it was difficult. That didn't bother her, though. The train knew where it was going. She smiled as she picked up her book. Her mother had been in utter despair over the news of her departure and accepting Robson's proposal. However, it hadn't been because her only daughter was leaving. Rather, she was leaving and taking the last of the Scott family money with her. Aura had rounded off their final meal together by wheedling in a way to ask Katelyn once again to transfer ownership of her bank account, simply for safekeeping, of course, she'd added. When Katelyn had looked agape at her mother, Aura had turned her pleading gaze to implore her husband to persuade Katelyn instead. Thankfully, George Drysdale's only concern was getting Katelyn out from under his roof so that there was one less mouth to feed. Katelyn had then been subjected to the opinions of Aura and her gaggle of friends who'd attended the dinner about just how exceedingly dangerous a trip west was going to be. Even once she arrived at her destination, they were sure she might be caught up in a war with the natives or threatened by bandits. Katelyn knew it was all quite exaggerated, and she'd be perfectly safe while on the train. She settled in to read. She awoke at some point later, blinking. The gentle swaying of the sleeper car must have made her nod off. The train was slowing. She'd have thought they were simply pulling into the next station, except that they weren't supposed to reach that town until much later in the evening. A glance out of the window told her that they'd stopped in the middle of nowhere. "What's going on?" she asked the elderly gentleman seated across the aisle from her. "Do you know why we're stopping?" He pointed out the window. "I'm no expert, but I'd say there's something wrong with the engine. Look at all that smoke." "But isn't there always smoke?" she argued, even as the troubling stories of Aura and her friends that she'd dismissed as nonsense slid into the edges of her mind. "Maybe it's an unscheduled stop?" The older man looked affronted. "Madam, this is the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line. The timing of these trains is of utmost importance. They're not going to make a spontaneous stop for anything." Katelyn peered through the glass once more. She heard the distant clatter and call of voices, which caused a ball of fear to form in her stomach. The porter soon appeared through the door at the front of the car, and Katelyn looked to him for reassurance. His grave expression told her he wasn't going to give her any. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we've got a problem with the engine. It's going to take quite a bit of time to repair. Now, the good news is that there's a small town not far from here that has a swing station. It'll be a bit of a walk, but it'll get all of you back on your journey." "Can't another engine come and pick us up?" asked a passenger near the back. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen for quite some time," the porter replied. "Please gather all your belongings." Several more complaints groused throughout the car as Katelyn pushed back her unease. She wasn't alone, she reminded herself. She gathered up her bag and popped her book in it, striving for a calm exterior, even as her mind ran amok with fear. Prosody. She eyed the other passengers as they gathered in the grass at the side of the tracks, each of them looking just as worried and put out as she felt. They trudged on for what felt like hours, the hot sun attempting to bake them into the earth the entire way. Katelyn mopped her brow with her handkerchief, glad that at least the humidity wasn't too bad here. It was a very small comfort, however. The hem of her dress was thoroughly dirtied, and her shoes were pinching her instep. She looked up every now and then, sure that she'd see a group of bandits descending on them. Finally, the only thing she saw in the distance was the small town the porter had mentioned. The porter, who'd been put in charge of getting them this far, easily found the swing station. "We're in luck. The next coach leaves shortly. It'll take you to what would have been our next stop." Katelyn only felt a minor amount of relief. She'd heard about the cramped and uncomfortable conditions on the stagecoach, and she'd looked forward to not having to deal with that until the final stretch into Parkstown, Kansas. She stared around her. The town was merely a collection of timber buildings, a few of which had horses tied up outside. The swing station was little more than a shack with a small stable behind it. The man who operated it was a scruffy one who obviously hadn't bathed in quite some time. "Excuse me," she called out. "Is there someplace nearby where I could?" His beady gaze meandered down over her frame. "Where you could?" She tried not to show how taken aback she was by the demand. "Where I could freshen up." He raised a thick eyebrow, and then after a pause, he nodded at a building with his head. "You could try the saloon over there." "Thank you." Feeling exposed and alone, Katelyn made her way across the strip of dust that served as a road and over to the saloon. Her insides quivered, but she knew this was only the first of many challenges she would face. If Parkstown was anything like this town, whatever town this was, then she might as well get used to it now. Dozens of men turned to stare at her as she stepped through the door. The chatter and buzz of the room dropped away to nothing. As all the attention turned to her, Katelyn took half a step back before she summoned her determination once again and approached the barkeep. He was short and burly, the thick mustache on his upper lip making up for his bald palate. His stare was cold and unfriendly. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the towel in his hands over his big shoulders and folded his arms in front of his barrel chest. "We don't serve women here." "That's all right," she replied quietly. "I just wanted to ask if I could use your powder room." "The what?" Her face reddened. "Our train broke down and we'll be catching the coach in a minute," she babbled, realizing when it was too late that she shouldn't be announcing to anyone that she was so vulnerable. "I just wanted to use your powder room if I could, please." The barkeep let out a snort of laughter. "Sure, if you really want to. It's out back. Thank you." With her cheeks burning and a keen awareness that every man in the saloon was staring at her, Katelyn rushed through the door that the barkeep had gestured to. The door led outside. She blinked in the sun, sure that someone had tricked her until she saw the outhouse. It leaned slightly to the side. Even from this distance, the stench of it smacked her in the face. She walked toward it as if it might strike out at her at any moment. With a bracing breath, she snatched open the door. It was no place to freshen up at all, and she tolerated it only for the smallest amount of time possible before she burst back out the door and into the sunshine. It's Place Noucent. Refusing to step foot back in the saloon, Katelyn made her way around the side of the building. She would get on the coach and never look back. If she was lucky, her destination would be more pleasant. At least the worst was over. There she is. Katelyn was startled as she reached the front corner of the saloon, and a man stepped down off the front porch. He was tall and rangy, and she was nearly blinded by the sun as she tried to look up at him. "Do I know you?" "No, but I'd sure like to get to know you." A round of raucous laughter echoed behind him, and Katelyn saw that he wasn't alone. Several other men stepped down into the dirt between the saloon and the building next door. True fear gripped her, and she was sure they could see it in her eyes. She tried to slow her racing pulse, her gaze on the ground. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I've got a coach to catch." "Oh, you've got a minute." Another man stepped up, his eyes sweeping rudely up and down her body. "In fact, I think it'd be nice if you stuck around for a while." A third approached her, head tilted as he eyed her like a tasty steak. "Me and the boys would like that a lot." She tried to step around him, but her path was blocked. She looked at them, terror sliding through her, turning her stomach to jelly. It was the tall one again. "You know, we don't get a lot of women around here. Judging by the way you smell, I can imagine why," she spat, curling her fist to keep her hands from shaking. "Oh ho, this one's got a sense of humor." Another man reached forward to touch her cheek, and she slapped his hand away. "And she's feisty, too." They weren't threatened in the least by her, and why should they be? They were out here in the middle of nowhere, despite some attempt to make this town look civilized. She summoned up every ounce of courage she had, hoping it was enough. She lifted her chin and squared her shoulders, prepared to march straight through the line of them that now divided her from the street. "Excuse me." "No, no." A hand grabbed her waist. "You're not going anywhere." She flung out her hands, desperate to make her escape. Several of her slaps landed, but they made no difference. "Leave her alone, boys." Chapter 3. The rough voice cut through those of her captors as they tried to decide just what they were going to do with her. The grip around her waist loosened, but she wasn't free yet. "Perhaps I wasn't clear enough, so I'll say again, leave her alone." The voice grew sterner. "I won't ask a third time." Slowly, one by one, hands were removed, and then she could breathe easier as the men moved further back. The one holding her waist finally let go as he let fly a curse word. "Is that really how it's going to be, Wade?" "Looks that way, don't it?" the tall one groused. "We were just having a little fun, Wade." "Well, Eli, I guess you and me have different ideas of fun then." Katelyn's hair had come undone, and she swept a curtain of dark strands out of her eyes to see a man standing in the street. He was tall and broad, with wide shoulders. Dark hair bloomed out from under his hat, and his mouth was hidden by a thick beard. Unkempt and grizzled, its growth suggested weeks, if not months, without the touch of a razor. A gray cloth tunic stretched across his chest, topped with a stained vest. He wore dust and grime like a second skin. Perhaps it was the twin pistols strapped to narrow hips that made the men move back. Perhaps it was the bright blue eyes that burned under the shade of his faded, battered hat. Whatever it was, they shrank back as he took a step forward. He eyed them all, stance ready. "Don't y'all have places to be?" Katelyn tried to shut her ears to the cursing and grumbling as the men made their way back up onto the porch of the saloon. She blinked quickly to stave off her tears. "I don't know how to thank you, sir." One huge shoulder lifted and then dropped, though he didn't offer a comment. "I'll be on my way. Thank you again." Katelyn nodded, and then she darted across the dusty road. It wasn't until her attention focused on the swing station that she noticed how quiet it was. In fact, it appeared abandoned. She spotted the same man who directed her to the saloon filling up a water trough with a hand pump. "Where did everyone go?" she demanded. He straightened up, frowning at her. "On the coach, of course." "Pardon?" The sun must be getting to her. "That couldn't be right. They left." "Well, that's what happens when the stagecoach arrives, ma'am," he responded as if he was talking to a child. "The horses and the passengers get swapped out. Doesn't take but a minute if someone knows what they're doing." "But I'm supposed to be on that stage," she wailed. "You knew that. Why didn't you make them wait?" The station keeper tipped his head to the side and regarded her with tired eyes. "The train don't wait for nobody, and neither do we." Her mind stumbled, mired in panic and dismay. All of the dire warnings from back home pooled into a writhing mass, and she felt like crying. Stranded in a strange town in the middle of nowhere, and the only people she'd met here so far were nothing short of villains. That included the station keeper, as far as she was concerned. She willed the panic back and tried to think. When is the next stagecoach due to arrive here? Oh, let's see. He dug a pocket watch from the inside pocket of his grimy vest. About 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. It was blazing hot, but cold fear now moved through her veins. Tomorrow. That meant she'd have to stay an entire night in this horrible place. It was obvious she couldn't trust the station keeper for any good information, so she was on her own. Her valise had been left near the small porch on the front of the station. She picked it up and turned back to the street, wondering where, if anywhere, she'd be able to find a safe haven. "Where are you headed?" "Oh." Katelyn clutched her chest with fear as that deep voice came out of nowhere once more. She whirled to see the gruff, bearded man standing a few yards away from her. He leaned with an elbow on a hitching post, his boot hooked across the other. That same steady blue gaze watched her, missing nothing. Katelyn was grateful to him for keeping those awful men away from her, but that didn't mean she trusted him. "That's my business. Thank you very much." "Suit yourself, miss, though you might want to take a look across the street." He bobbed his head casually, managing to work in a nod toward the saloon. Katelyn's eyes slid to the side. The men who'd harassed her were still there in front of the building. They too were lounging casually in various states along the front of the building. Each of them had their gaze fixed on her. She swallowed down on her whimper. She looked at him, hating that she was left with no option but to trust him. Perhaps you could tell me where I might find a reputable inn in town where I could spend the night until the next coach comes. He reached over and rubbed the nose of a buckskin gelding who dozed at the hitching post. I can't do that. Her mouth popped open. I thought you were trying to help me. His mouth twisted and he sniffed, his eyes darting across the street before they moved back to her face. I asked you where you were headed. Now you're just being obstructive and it's annoying me. Don't know what that means. He untied the rope securing the gelding with a quick yank and fiddled with the leather straps looped around him. She watched as he slid the arms of the cart through the harness, and for a moment, she thought he meant to leave her. Please, she began, and he paused, tilted his head to stare at her over a shoulder. I just need somewhere to stay. I can catch the coach and... There isn't a reputable lodging within 50 miles of this place, miss, he snapped. 50. Katelyn's breath shuddered out of her chest. I don't know how much farther I need to go. I'm heading Parkstown, Kansas. His hands stilled and his eyes narrowed on her. Then he returned his attention to the harness. I know where Parkstown is, he muttered, his voice rumbling low in his big chest. He yanked one strap, then two, tightening them. He rested both hands on the horse's flank and speared her with a look. It's one of my stops on my rounds. I can take you, for a fee. Her throat was tight. Every muscle in her body was tense. She felt as though she might burst. Was everything so impossible out here? I don't have any cash, but I do have this. Katelyn frowned as she reached up, unpinned her brooch, and handed it to him. The dark scowl was back. Up close, his eyes were intense as they raked her face. She took an involuntary step back as he studied the piece of jewelry. He checked her clothing, thick brows meeting under the filthy brim of his hat. Where did that come from? I had it pinned on inside out, she explained stubbornly, cheeks turning red under the scrutiny. I'm not a complete fool to wear something so expensive right where everyone can see. It belonged to my grandmother. He ran a thick finger over the delicately carved shell of the cameo. When he shook his head and sighed, Katelyn thought he was going to reject the offer. Then he slipped it into his pocket and held out a hand to help her up into the cart. Katelyn released a breath that she hadn't realized she was holding. She stepped forward, but then she stopped when her eyes landed on the empty seat. There won't be anyone to chaperone. He was still holding out his hand. What? A chaperone, she repeated, to protect my reputation. Surely, even all the way out here, a man would understand such a thing. He merely gave a quick glance across the street to make his point. Right now, I think your reputation should be the least of your worries. Katelyn didn't bother to look. She knew exactly what he meant. If she didn't get in the cart right now, she'd be left with those awful ruffians. There were probably plenty more like them along the way, too. Without sparing the group a glance, she took his hand and allowed him to help her up into the cart. Chapter 4. The wooden cart trundled along the road, its sandy surface hissing against the wheels, the noise interspersed by the clip-clop of the horse and evening crickets. Boundless plains surrounded them, stretching in either direction in a beautiful tapestry of gold and tawny grasses that wafted gently with the evening breeze. The sun streaked the sky with lavender and orange as it slid towards the horizon. Echoes of the town faded to nothing, leaving only the susurration of the wind through the golden tussocks and wildflowers. Katelyn gnawed the inside of her cheek as the silence stretched on. She was all alone with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Had she jumped from a dangerous situation into an even worse one? She cast surreptitious glances in his direction. Her curiosity piqued as she tried to gauge him. The setting sun caught the high cheekbones above the beard, the rest of his face obscured by the brim of his hat. She couldn't read him any more than she could something written in Sanskrit. Do you always fidget this much? The deep voice startled her, and she jolted, laughing a little to conceal her discomfiture. I'm sorry, she wafted a gloved hand in front of her face. I don't even know your name, sir. I'm a little thrown off by everything, all told. I've never goodness, and now I'm rambling, aren't I? He let out a long, suffering sigh, staring ahead. She was left with the distinct impression that he was regretting his decision to offer her safety. Thank you again for what you did back there. You didn't have to step in, but I'm very glad that you were there. His head bobbed once. I suppose I should at least introduce myself, she said when he remained mute. I'm Katelyn Scott of Providence, Rhode Island. Wade, it was the name she'd heard the ruffian say. Wade, she repeated, expecting him to elaborate. When he didn't, she tried again. Where are you from? He made a vague gesture with his hand. Around. Katelyn smoothed out her skirts, tamping down on the bite of annoyance. He was her savior. She couldn't get cross simply because he wasn't as glib or chatty as the simpering idiots she'd been introduced to back home. Do you know those men back there? Not really. It's just, they seemed a little intimidated by you, mister. He kept his eyes firmly ahead and his hands on the reins. She wasn't going to sit silently in this cart next to him all the way to Parkstown, though she had the distinct impression that he wished she would. You mentioned that you were on your rounds. Are you a... She frowned, trying to think what a man who looked like he did do for work and why he'd been on rounds. You're not a doctor? I'm a trapper. He thumbed over his shoulder. I'm sure you already figured that out, though. Katelyn glanced over her shoulder and into the bed of the cart, where several piles of furs had been stacked and lashed with twine. She'd seen the fine stoles that her mother treasured, but she'd never been particularly fond of them. What Wade had in the back of the cart seemed much more crude, mere bundles of fur and skin that hadn't been made into anything specific. I suppose I should be thankful that there are no dead animals back there. I make enough to survive. She turned back around, wondering if she'd said the wrong thing. He steered them off the relatively smooth road and into a tract of wooded land that provided welcome shade from the sun. A fresh wave of worries sloshed over her. Mister, she began, and had to gather her panicked thoughts. Wade, I'm sorry, being on first-name terms with a new acquaintance takes a little getting used to. His shoulder moved a little, and he clicked his tongue at the horse as they headed into the gloom. The cart wobbled over the ruts, and her hands flew to the edges of the seat. Wade and his steed didn't flinch. He ducked under a low-hanging branch. This is the road to Parkstown? Her voice sounded thready, even to her ears. He looked at her then, and she felt the impact of it across her skin. No. She gaped at him, a kaleidoscope of fears tumbling through her mind. Then where are you taking me? He lifted a finger to point. Up ahead, tucked away between the evergreens, was a tiny cabin. There. As they got closer, she saw a small window and a box out on the stumpy porch. Is this where you live? He pulled the cart all the way up to the entrance before he hopped down, his big bulk moving with surprising ease and dexterity. Just a place to stop for the night. She swallowed, the audible gulp pulling his attention to her. He let out one of his long exhales again. If I was going to hurt you, don't you think I'd have done it as soon as we were clear of Eli and his band of yaks? She turned her head. His expression was closed off. That wasn't what I was thinking about. That part was true, at least. She felt safe, at least for the moment. Perhaps it was because he'd defended her, or perhaps because he'd helped her out more than anyone else that she'd met on this journey so far. But Katelyn felt safe with Wade. His mouth twisted into a smirk, and he propped his elbow on the edge of the bench. That so? Her chin inched up a little. Yes. He waited, his bright blue eyes waiting. She arched her brow, not liking how he was able to unnerve her by a single look, nor make words rush up to her mouth before she'd had a chance to consider them fully. My mother would have kittens if she could see me now, that's all. He lifted a hand, his tone droll as he said, She sounds a real hoot. Ora Drysdale was many things, but she didn't have much of a sense of humor. She allowed him to lift her down, trying to still her thundering heartbeat and heat from where his hands had wrapped around her small waist. It had been a very long and eventful day, she reasoned, and that was why her body was betraying her so. Wade busied himself with setting several things on the ground by his feet as she studied the cabin. A dozen questions flitted through her mind, but she knew he wouldn't answer any of them. Instead, she turned to practical things. Could you tell me if there's an outhouse? She knew better than to ask for a powder room now. A hint of a smile showed through the thickness of his beard. Anywhere you want it to be. There's a stream back that way about 100 yards where you can wash up. I'll stay here and start supper. Thank you. Her stomach quailed at the thought of heading into the woods by herself, but she couldn't exactly bring him with her. She left him there in front of the cabin and rounded the corner of the building. A scuffling sounded off to her left, but it was just a squirrel. She kept on, hoping she wouldn't get lost. The rushing sound of the stream soon hit her ears, and she saw the sparkling light of sunset glinting off the water. As tired as she was, Katelyn hurried forward. She fell to her knees on the bank and plunged her hands into the stream, splashing water on her face. It was shockingly cold, but it felt so good to wash away all that dirt and dust. When she was finished with her ablutions, Katelyn was pleased with herself that she returned to the cabin without issue. The gelding had been unhooked from the cart and was hobbled nearby, nibbling at the grass. 7%. The cart had been moved to the side, and Wade had set up a fire within the pit in front of the little house. A spit had been erected over this, where something was currently roasting and filling the air with a delectable smell. It won't be long, Wade assured her as she came and sat down on a nearby log. Tea? She eyed the canister he held out, surprised to find any such luxury out here. Katelyn accepted it, taking enough to slake her thirst without being greedy. She opened her mouth to ask him what, exactly, was roasting. Considering they were in the middle of nowhere, she decided it was better not to find out. She sat in the silence he seemed to relish, watching the flames dance whilst he tended to their meal. He moved fluidly and with competence, handing her a chunk of meat within a can before he dropped to the ground on the opposite side of the fire. Wordlessly, she took it. She considered it a moment, thinking of all the thousands of sublime meals she'd consumed over the years and how she'd taken them all for granted. He tore into the meat with relish. She copied him, her brows dancing up when she realized just how delicious it was. "You said you've stayed here before?" she asked as she tossed a bone into the fire, modeling her actions on his. Yes. Apparently, hunger wasn't what had kept him from engaging in any sort of conversation. "Parkstown is one of your stops? Where else do you go?" Not that she would have a clue where any of these places might be. Those bright blue eyes of his still managed to blaze even in the encroaching darkness as he glanced at her. A little bit of everywhere. "And what about family?" she continued, determined to get something out of him. He put his hands on his knees and stood with such speed that Katelyn leaned back, but he turned toward the cabin. "It's time to turn in. I'll show you where you'll be for the night." Without much choice, a situation that was happening far too much, Katelyn followed him inside. The cabin was just one room. Dried leaves filled the corners. The red hue of the fire lighting up a small bed sat along one wall, and a rusted stove hunched in the corner. He lit a stubby candle on a plate for her, straightening up as she turned a small circle, staring around the humble space. "You take the cot," Wade said. "I'll be outside." "Take these with you, then." Kate flicked her fingers toward the furs that had been laid out on the little bed. "I don't want them." He raised an eyebrow, and again she thought she saw the faint movement of a smile. "I think you will." "It's been hot and miserable all day," she pointed out, wondering if he'd been trekking the west for so long that he could no longer see just how uncomfortable it was. "And they're just dead animals." A small snort from him might have been laughter. "They'll still keep you good company tonight." Before she could say anything further, he went back out onto the small porch and shut the door behind him. Delightful. Katelyn glared at the closed door. She had to be grateful to Wade for keeping her safe thus far. To look at, with that bushy black beard and his unkempt clothes, she would have judged him to be far more dangerous than anyone she'd met since she'd left Rhode Island. His actions were mostly proving otherwise, though she still couldn't say she appreciated his insistence on these musty old furs. Katelyn approached the cot and peeled back the first layer of furs with 2 fingers. Underneath, she saw that the cot itself was far mustier and moldier. Perhaps the furs were needed, after all. Exhausted from the events of the day, She left her shoes on the floor and carefully lay down, expecting to fall asleep as soon as she closed her eyes. Something howled in the distance. Katelyn sat up, listening. Could whatever that was get into the cabin? Surely not. She laid down once again, only to be disturbed a few minutes later by someone's ridiculous laughter. It sounded like it was right outside the little window, set high into the wall. Who was out there? It had to be a madman if he sounded like that. What about Wade? Or was he the madman? A large silhouette drifted past the window, outlined by the stars. It was an owl. Just an owl. The noise of the city was an entirely different thing, and she missed it. She also missed the comfortable feather bed and the soft coverlet. A shiver ran up her spine, but at the moment it wasn't one of fear. She was genuinely cold. How could it get that chilly when she'd been horrifically hot the rest of the day? Giving up, Katelyn wrapped herself in the furs Wade had left for her. She supposed he knew what he was doing, though she wasn't going to tell him that. Something shuffled in the underbrush outside. Another animal of some kind? Why didn't they just go on about their business instead of swarming around this little cabin? Every time Katelyn's eyes began to droop closed, they snapped open again when she heard another sound. It was going to be a long night. Chapter 5. Katelyn jolted awake. She'd managed to doze off, mostly thanks to the warmth of the furs, but she couldn't manage to stay asleep. There was simply too much to think about, too much to worry about. First and foremost on her mind was the fact that she hadn't seen Wade again since he'd shown her to her bed. She'd imagined at first that he'd simply planned to stay up for a while and that he would come into the cabin at some point. Not that she relished the idea of sleeping in the same room with a complete stranger, but she wasn't particularly fond of the idea that he might have abandoned her. He'd gotten her out of that horrid town, as he'd promised, but Katelyn imagined he probably thought of her as a burden. How easy would it be for him to simply sneak off in the night, taking that precious brooch that was worth more than half a day's work? Through the window, she saw that daylight was just beginning to break. The sky had lightened from a pitch black to a deep blue, and further toward the horizon it had paled to a sapphire. Katelyn rolled up and sat on the side of the bed, wiping her face with the back of her hand as she tried to get her wits about her. What was she going to do? She didn't even know what direction to head. She could be wandering through the woods forever. What other brigands might she encounter along the way? And with nobody to help her? Her stomach grumbled with hunger despite her fears, reminding her that staying inside here wasn't going to get her any further toward Parkstown. Katelyn put on her shoes and slowly opened the door. It met with resistance, though not one she couldn't overcome with just a little more effort. She peeked through the opening she'd made and saw that the door had hit a pallet of furs that had been laid out across the threshold. The cart was parked just where it had been last night, and the horse wasn't far off. Despite herself, Katelyn smiled as she stepped over the pallet. Wade was a gruff man who didn't want to have any conversation or companionship on this unplanned voyage. Even so, he'd made sure she was protected from anything or anyone who might try to get into the cabin. Perhaps there was a little bit of a gentleman inside him after all. She drew in a deep breath. The cool air was refreshing, the damp scent of the woods cleansing her. Ora Drysdale would be astonished that her daughter, the city girl, had slept in such surroundings. Katelyn peeked around the edge of the cabin, frowning at the empty space. Wade couldn't have gone far if his cart and his cargo were here, yet she couldn't stop the little fluttering of unease. The snap of a twig brought her head up as she stepped off the porch. Her heart slammed into her throat, trapping a scream when she spotted a man standing just on the edge of the clearing. Fear jolted through her veins as she took in the strong nose and square jaw, the wet hair gleaming in the low light. However, it was those blazing blue eyes that unsettled her the most. It wasn't some man. It was Wade. "Good morning," he grunted as he moved forward, slipping past her to roll up the furs and blankets he'd slept on the night before. "You shaved." "Have to, eventually. It gets too hot for the beard." Katelyn stepped aside and watched him. His face was angular, his hair as dark as the beard, though she could see a little silver beginning to thread through it. He'd changed his shirt for a lighter blue, She hadn't realized just how handsome he was before, not with all that hair in front of his face. It had changed his look completely, a fascinating difference. Realizing she was staring, she stepped back into the cabin and did her best to make a bundle out of the furs he'd loaned her. She hefted the wad through the door. Wade had made quick work of packing up the camp. "How long will it take us to get to Parkstown?" she asked as she lifted the bundle into the back of the cart, surprised at just how heavy it was. It unrolled slightly, unlike the neat little packages that Wade seemed to make of everything. He eyed her work but didn't correct it. Another 2 days. 2 days. Her stomach jumped. If only she hadn't missed that stage. If only the train hadn't broken down. She'd already be safely at her destination by now, if everything had just gone to plan. One thing for certain was that she wouldn't be writing to her mother or her friends about this particular part of the trip, providing that she made it out here alive. They would be all too eager to say they'd told her so, and to reprimand her for ever thinking it was a better idea to go gallivanting to the west than to stay at home where things were safe and known. Wade stabbed the toe of a scuffed boot into the ashes of the previous night's fire to ensure they wouldn't catch again. "Unfortunately, I don't travel as fast as one of those locomotives." "I know." She also knew that she ought to be grateful she had any sort of transportation at all, but it was difficult to feel gratitude when she felt filthy, lost, and at least a little bit hopeless. "I have a route to follow and stops to make along the way." She nodded. "Of course, I understand." "What's so urgent in Parkstown anyway?" Wade unhobbled the horse and brought it over to the cart. Katelyn straightened her shoulders, confident in the fact that at least she had a good reason for traveling. "I'm engaged to be married to a man." He stopped, humor glinting in his face as he tried to suppress a grin. "You're one of those mail-order brides?" His mocking tone annoyed her more than anything disdainful that had been said to her by Aura or any of her friends. "I'll have you know that it's a perfectly legitimate and acceptable way to make a connection with a man," she sniffed primly. "And he happens to be an established and esteemed rancher named Robson Nash." His hands paused and those gem-like eyes flashed to her again. Amusement had vanished, and his face was shuttered once more. Despite the rising temperature of the day, a chilly finger ran down her spine under his stare. Wade broke the look and went back to hitching the horse to the wagon, his hands moving with practiced ease. "We're not going to get there by standing around." Katelyn frowned. For a moment, he'd started to thaw towards her. She racked her brain, recalling what she'd said to him. Was he cross because she was engaged? She glanced at Wade, though he was unreadable. "Do you know Mr. Nash?" "Can't say as I do," he muttered, tugging at a cinch. "I just thought you may have heard of him on your rounds." Wade paused, his hands on the buckskin's back. "Lady, I'm just here to offer you a ride. You are a cargo that I'm delivering, much as I do these furs. Let's keep the chit-chat today to a minimum." Katelyn's lips parted as she stared. He vanished behind the horse as he continued with his tasks, and she was grateful to have a little space to compose herself. She had to remember that whilst his actions had seemed gentlemanly, he wasn't one of her educated suitors. He was a trader, fine and simple. There was little left to do to prepare for the day's travel, and it was soon time to head out. Wade once again reached out a hand to help her up into the cart. Katelyn took it, wondering if she imagined his fingers lingering on his for just a fraction of a second after she was seated. No, that couldn't be. She was nothing more than a transaction. Her grandmother's brooch was his fee. 7%. Wade didn't think about her any more than the express man thought about the packages he was in charge of on the train. That suited her just fine. The rutted track down to the road was rough and bumpy, but their passage smoothed out quickly once they resumed the journey along the main road. The trees kept the worst of the sun off the back of her neck as it rose into the sky. She caught sight of woodpeckers and heard the warblers in the trees. A small herd of white-tailed deer bound over the grasses. Wade didn't flinch when a garter snake startled the horse as it slithered across the track in front of him. Are there more of those?" she muttered, eyeing the grass that the snake had disappeared into. "Sure," he shrugged. resuming his position where he rested his elbows on his knees and stared silently ahead. She shuddered. Goodness me. It's the copperheads that you have to worry about. Venomous, too. They can fell a horse in seconds. Her eyes slid shut. She'd not considered the critters that she would be sharing a home with out here. When she opened them, he was watching her. Dimples bracketed his mouth. That's not funny, Wade. He shook his head, failing to stop the smile that kicked at the edges of his lips. No, ma'am. He was talking to her, so that made a welcome change to his stony silence. She wanted to pass the time a little quicker and not think about what else lurked in the grasses. How long have you been a trapper? A while. She searched around in her mind for something else. She leaned over, checking the ground beneath them as she asked, Do you go to Parkstown often? When I have to. She cocked a brow at him. I know you said to keep the conversation to a minimum, but we have a long, long way to go. You could expand a little, make these things more of a two-way effort. The irritating smirk was back, though his eyes were on the road ahead. What do you want to know? From what little I've read about the subject, I'm given to understand that a trapper catches animals to sell the furs. Do you sell them on your stops? Sometimes. Katelyn fixed him with a pointed look, and he expanded reluctantly. I mean, sometimes I sell them for money. Sometimes I trade them. For what? His shoulder moved up, dropped back down. Whatever I need. She sat back. She was beginning to piece together this odd, nomadic existence. You make your trips to the same towns? He nodded. People know that I stop by every so often. They'll be there waiting, or they might have left things for me in a store. You don't interact with civilization much? Not if I can help it, he muttered. I'm fortunate then. That got his attention. She smiled. If you were only passing through that excuse of a town, I don't dare to imagine what would have happened if you'd been late, or worse, not there. I doubt that anyone else there would have helped me the way that you have. Plus, I'm lucky that you were already heading to Parkstown if you don't go there often. If you hadn't been there, poor Mr. Nash and I wouldn't be getting married at all. His brows furrowed, and he brooded some more. She bit back a sigh. She'd paid him a compliment, thanked him, and was left with the distinct feeling she made him cross. She wanted to know what about him made him averse to people. Why would a man prefer to eat meat over an open fire instead of by candlelight at a table? She wished she knew if it was her presence that was making him act this way, or if he was just consistently grumpy and moody. Katelyn went back over their previous conversations, if they could even be called that, in her mind. Her curiosity was piqued, but she wasn't sure how else to bring up the subject. You know, if there's a town nearby that has a train station to take me right to Parkstown, you could take me there? His eyes flicked to her. Only by stagecoach. Railway hasn't been built in these parts, Miss East Coast. The nickname stung, and she allowed a little of her exasperation with him to leak into her voice. It's just that my presence next to you seems to annoy you, Wade. I thought that maybe you'd like to drop me off somewhere sooner so that I can get out of your way. He laughed lazily. From where I'm sitting, the only one getting uptight is you. Why don't you just take in the scenery and enjoy the state where you're going to live? Her cheeks flamed as her temper boiled inside. She'd never met such an infuriating man. She folded her arms, clamping her mouth shut until her jaw ached. She would do as he told her, sit quietly and watch the scenery. In fact, they could be going in circles, and she might not even know it. She had at least another day of scenery to look at. Scenery and silence. She sighed, her internal dialogue going wild. All she had to do was wait. Her mind drifted to her future husband. Surely they would come across a town soon enough. Perhaps there would be a way of sending a telegraph to Robson. She wondered if word of the broken-down train had reached him yet. If not, he would surely think that she had changed her mind. If he had heard about it, then he must be frantic with worry for her. She contented herself with thinking about Robson Nash, his ranch, and how she would become a wife to a man who lived alongside copperhead snakes. Chapter 6. Just like they had yesterday, as the sun was beginning to set, the cart slowed and pulled off the main road into a clearing. The sun still provided enough light through the canopy of trees for them to make camp. Katelyn looked around for another cabin, but she saw nothing but trees and bushes. Why are we stopping here? It's time to stop for the night. Here? He'd barely said a word to her all afternoon, other than to offer her water from the canteen and some leather-like meat that tasted wonderful, and the one time he stopped so that she could take a natural break. That's right, she was getting impatient with his short, insufficient answers. There's no cabin here. We were lucky to have what we did last night. Wade hopped down and came around to her side of the cart. He managed to hand her down without making any eye contact, focusing vaguely on her shoulder instead. We'll have to make our own shelter tonight, or we can sleep under the stars. A shudder roiled through her body at the thought. It was bad enough having nothing more than a log wall between herself and the wild. Now there wouldn't be anything. You cannot be serious. Fine, go find a hotel then. He gestured across the trees. You're being an inconsiderate dullard, Wade, she snapped, fisting her hands on her hips. It felt good to let loose a little of her fire that she'd spent the afternoon banking inside. It was a perfectly acceptable question, considering we've seen lynxes and snakes and countless other wild animals today. He'd straightened to look at her. He waited a moment, long enough for her to gain control of her mouth and brush back a lock of her hair. What did you call me? She cleared her throat, breaking his gaze. I apologize, Wade. That was rude and uncalled for. He didn't seem all that fazed. In fact, he seemed happy. I've used this clearing countless times. You'll be fine. Is it safe? It hasn't killed me yet. How reassuring, Katelyn muttered. She watched as he unhitched the horse. She looked around, but the space was nothing more than a bit of semi-cleared land. If there were a home of some sort, she'd have an idea of what to do. Can I at least help in some way? Wade snorted. You're a woman. And? Full of fury, fueled by frustration and exhaustion, her hands were back on her hips. You're not going to be good at anything out here. Well, that certainly confirmed her suspicion earlier that he thought of her as nothing more than a burden. She hadn't liked it, and now she hated it. I can do anything you can do. Just tell me what you need. He chuckled, though he sobered when her brow shot up. She folded her arms when she caught the challenge in his gaze. She gave it right back at him. All right, then. He shook his head, stomping around the side of the items that he'd been offloading. He dipped for something. You can go find our supper. He shoved a rifle at her. Katelyn staggered back as she wrapped her hands around the big weapon. It was long and slim, but far heavier than it looked with the wood stock and the metal barrel. The weight of it was awkward and unbalanced in her unskilled hands, and the whole thing threatened to go straight for the ground. She frantically rearranged her hands until she clung the weapon to her chest. She'd meant rolling out blankets or finding kindling, not shooting an animal to eat. But she wasn't going to let him think he could make fun of her like that. Feeling defiant, she turned and marched into the woods. When she was no longer in sight of the clearing, Katelyn allowed her shoulders to sag. Just carrying the gun was heavy. How was she supposed to shoot it? Never in her life had she had any reason to handle a gun. It simply wasn't necessary in the sort of life she lived. Experimentally, she brought it up to her shoulder, the way she thought she should if she were going to use it. Even the slimmer end of the thing was too heavy, and it quickly drooped to point at the earth. She'd better find something low to the ground to shoot. Of course, she had to find something in the first place. Though every animal in Kansas had crept around the cabin the night before and leaped across their path today, not a single one of them was in sight right now. Her gaze was on the ground. Hadn't she read somewhere that snakes liked rocks and piles of leaves, the kind that crunched underfoot now? She let out a shudder. This was madness. Only her ego was keeping her here. She paused, Wade's mocking look in her mind's eye as she'd almost dropped the rifle. She couldn't go back empty-handed. She looked around her, peering around the tree trunks, trying to remember anything someone might have mentioned about hunting. It was no use. Katelyn only knew the general idea, and it wasn't going to help. She tiptoed forward, reasoning that she'd have to be quiet. Her stomach growled, reminding her just how important it was to make this happen. Not only was she hungry, but she also didn't want Wade to think he was right. He may know a lot about the wilderness and animals, but surely it couldn't take too much genius to shoot some defenseless animal and drag it back to the campfire. There, something was moving up ahead. The underbrush was thicker here, and Katelyn couldn't tell what it was. She fumbled with the gun as she watched the branches wavering, indicating that the creature was coming closer. Her heart was in her throat. Her fingers desperately searched for the trigger. Even if she pulled it, would it work? Katelyn took an uncertain step back. The bushes parted. Something dark and solid came charging at her. Brown bristles stood out all over its body. A deep, grunting scream issued from its throat through its open mouth. Two tusks, brilliantly white against the falling darkness of the woods and dangerously sharp, were aimed right at her. Her own mouth opened in a silent scream as she saw her own death charging right at her. A powerful crack issued through the woods, and the beast fell to the ground just inches from her feet. She backed away, her hand covering her mouth as a sob racked her body. She looked to the side to see Wade standing there, the barrel of his rifle still smoking. Her vision blurred to tears the next moment. Her arrogance, her desire to prove herself simply because she thought she could, had nearly gotten her killed. Bird calls filled the air, disturbed by the sudden intrusion of gunfire. Her ears rang from the noise, her legs trembling as the animal near her feet twitched in death throes. Slowly, the wildlife around them settled. Wade stood quietly, watching her as she tried to get control of herself. "What was that?" she finally managed, nearly screaming the question at Wade while she pointed at the dead animal on the ground. "Wild boar." He braced his gun over his shoulder as he stepped forward to examine it. "A big one, too. Was it? It was going to kill me, wasn't it?" More tears came. She felt them mixing with the dirt on her face. He nodded. "They're aggressive." "How dare you do this to me?" she screamed, stamping her foot for emphasis. "You sent me out here to get supper when you knew there was something so dangerous, something that would just come charging at me for no reason, and I might as well have been completely unarmed for all the good this gun would have done me." Katelyn threw the weapon at him. He caught it easily, lifting it as though it weighed no more than a dry twig. "That's not what I meant to happen." She could hardly even hear him over the boiling of the blood in her veins. "You're no better than anyone else, sending me right into the mouth of danger for your own amusement. Now get this thing out of here and leave me alone." Katelyn turned away from him and braced herself against a nearby tree trunk as she wept. In truth, she wasn't only crying about the boar. It had been terrifying, and she knew it would have severely injured or even killed her. That scare was more than she could handle, especially on top of everything else. She'd been stoic for a long time, dealing with her father's death and her mother's erratic behavior. She was crying in a way that she'd not allowed herself to do, not once since she'd heard about her father's death. Katelyn had had to be on guard to protect her future, though up until recently she hadn't even known what her future had been. Though some of that had been made clearer by agreeing to marry Robson, the road to get there was becoming more and more impossible every day. Her tears eventually slowed. Katelyn took a deep, shaking breath and straightened. She was tired and scared, and it felt as though she'd been that way forever. It wouldn't, however, get any better by standing here crying. "You can cry about it?" her father used to say, "but then you have to do something about it." He'd been absolutely right, and Katelyn couldn't think of a situation his old adage applied to any more than this one. She had to get to Parkstown, to Robson Nash. Then she'd have the safety of a real house and the security of farmland. That had to be much better than this. She sniffed, knuckling away her tears, patting her cheeks and fanning the hot flesh. She caught sight of the white cloth in the corner of her eye and recognized the tanned hand. Wade hadn't moved. She took the cloth he offered her, using it to wipe her face, as another kind of heat scored her face, that of humiliation. "I thought I told you to leave me alone," she said. He cleared his throat. "Never been much good at doing as I was told." Katelyn huffed out a reluctant laugh. "Then we have something in common." "I was thoughtless and tactless, Miss Scott." His voice was low and rough. "I shouldn't have let you go off alone. I'm sorry." Katelyn dabbed at her cheeks, her eyes filling with a fresh wave of tears. I don't usually cry, at least not in front of people, she admitted. He shrugged self-consciously. I won't tell anyone. She inhaled again, looking back at the boar. Is that edible? He grinned at her then, genuine warmth twinkling in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, she inclined her head, her heart tripping about in her chest for another reason other than impending death now. Then the altercation wasn't a complete waste of time, then? He led her back to the camp. Whilst she built the fire, he prepared the meal. She found a trickle of a stream within view of Wade, splashing water on her face whilst thinking about the deep, hot bath that she was going to draw for herself just as soon as she could. The tantalizing scent of slowly roasting pork filled her senses as she took up a rock that doubled as a perch. He'd arranged a pile of furs on top for her, and she sent him a brief smile as she plopped down on them. She caught him watching her, his gaze unreadable in the soft glow of the fire. I'm used to doing this by myself. I should have taken your offer to help more seriously, Wade said, adding a log to the fire. A bit of fat dripped down into the flames and sizzled, making the smell all the more enticing. At most, I figured you'd scare up a rabbit or something. She pointed to the boar's carcass on the other side of the clearing. That's got to be the biggest rabbit I've ever seen. Wade let out a snort, and then another one. A moment later, it turned into deep, rolling laughter. Before she could stop herself, Katelyn was laughing along with him. The tears that escaped the corners of her eyes were entirely different now, and she welcomed the change. When they caught their breath, she looked at him with sincerity. I should thank you for saving my life. More than once, I think. Wade brushed aside her gratitude with a flick of his fingers. That's how things should be, especially in a place like this. Yes. She arranged the skirt of her dress around her legs, trying to make herself comfortable regardless of the circumstances. I didn't believe my family and friends when they tried to stop me from coming here. They told me how dangerous the frontier is, but I was stubborn and prideful. He studied her from where he crouched, his hands braced on a short stick and his chin on his hands. Why did you come out here? This is nothing like Providence. Even Parkstown will feel primitive compared to what you must be used to. Katelyn pulled in a deep breath that came out as a sigh. Yes, but I felt that I had to. My father passed away suddenly. I'm afraid he was the only responsible parent I had. My mother frittered away everything that he and my grandparents had worked so hard for. Once I came of age, she then turned her greedy mind to ensure she got her hands on my share also. Her actions were all done under the guise of being done for my own good, her words. But I knew better. She was trying to marry me off to all and sundry whilst pestering me to hand over the funds for safekeeping. Finding a husband, a man that she had no influence over, was the only way I saw to get away from her. Katelyn's lips moved a little. Of course, picking a husband on the frontier has more of a shock factor, which I admit to my shame, held more than a little allure to me. Ora Drysdale likes to do things in a proper way, Katelyn added bitterly. What you saw in the woods was a little more than terror. I don't like to show my emotions. Mother says that it's unbecoming. I see. Wade turned around and dug in a knapsack for a moment before producing an apple. He tossed it across the fire. Katelyn caught it. She smoothed her fingers over the skin for a moment before she sank her teeth into it. The fruit was a shock of refreshment after such a hard day, and she closed her eyes to savor it. As she did, she realized that this was the most conversation she'd had with Wade in the entirety of the time they'd known each other. What about you? She asked once she'd swallowed. How did you become a trapper? He shook his head and frowned a little. It was just the easier option. Katelyn didn't see anything easy about his life, but this time she stopped herself from questioning him any further. She wanted to hold on to what bit of companionship she'd found with him, much preferring that to being in contention with him all the time. After all, they still had a day's travel ahead of them. They ate in companionable silence. As the last of the sun's rays gave way to the dark chill of night, Wade stood up and stretched. I think we should call it a night. You've got the shelter there? I'll sleep here by the fire. She looked where he pointed. She hadn't even noticed the oiled cloth that he'd pitched over a low-hanging branch. It made a very small shelter underneath, and the opening faced the fire. Several furs had been laid in the bottom as a floor. It would keep off any rain or frost, but not much else. "Oh, what's the matter?" he asked gently when she didn't move toward it. "I've never slept outside before," she replied. "To be honest, even last night in the cabin was terrifying for me." "I'll be right here," he offered. Her eyes traveled the distance between the fire and the bed. "Would you feel easier if I was sleeping next to you?" Relieved, she nodded. Wade pursed his lips. A familiar gesture Katelyn might have missed had he not recently shaved his thick beard. "All right then, let's settle in." Wade approached the makeshift tent, adjusting its sides and layering another fur to accommodate them both. Despite the circumstances, Katelyn hesitated. She could almost hear her mother's disapproving tsk, shocked at such impropriety. But, as Wade had mentioned yesterday, her reputation was already compromised. What mattered now was security and rest. Wade sat down, stretching himself out on the improvised bed. He set his hat on his flat belly and stacked his hands behind his head. After a beat, he turned his head to look at her. With the flames dancing over his features, she found him even more alluring. "What's wrong?" Numbly, she shook her head and stepped toward him. "This side," he patted the ground nearest the fire. "I'll keep the fire stoked throughout the night. Animals are scared of it." "All right," she murmured. She sat on the ground, her body aware of his, as she arranged one of the furs over her legs. She lay down flat. The fire's warmth caressed their feet, the furs cushioning them. Beside her, Wade had already succumbed to sleep. She edged a little closer to him, thinking about all the wild animals beyond the cloth. Teeth and claws. Wade's gentle snores filled the silence. Giving in, Katelyn nestled in closer to him until her back was touching his shoulder. Just that simple contact eased her fears. Lost in the mesmerizing dance of the flames against the silky night, Katelyn drifted off to sleep. Chapter 7. The clanking and clattering of pots and pans woke Katelyn the next morning. Her body felt heavy, and her foot had fallen asleep. She rolled over, realizing just how hard she'd slept. She swiped at her eyes and sat up. Wade was over near the fire, but he hadn't lit it yet. She took a moment to look at him. He must have washed. His hair was slicked away from his face. He was pulling cans from a sack, preparing to make breakfast. She kicked the furs off her legs, and he looked over at her. "You snore." Her lips responded to the teasing in his voice. She unfolded herself and stood tall, stretching her arms. "I was exhausted. I don't need to ask if you slept well." "Surprisingly well," she admitted. "I'll be back in a moment." Katelyn slipped into the woods and refreshed herself in the same trickle of a stream she'd found the previous day. She might be useless when it came to hunting down their food, but she did know how to collect firewood. On the way back, she picked up an armful of dry branches and twigs. Wade lifted his eyebrows in a welcome surprise when she returned to the clearing. "You've just saved us some time." "Then let's see what else I can do for that. What supplies do you have?" She knelt down next to the pack he'd been looking through. While Wade cut strips of bacon, Katelyn mixed up some cornmeal cakes and set them to fry in a bit of fat. He'd traded for eggs in a previous town, which had survived the trip in a small crate of straw. These made an easy addition to the rest of their breakfast. In short order, they were dining off of heavily loaded tin plates. "I didn't realize you knew how to cook," Wade said as he helped himself to another cornmeal cake. Katelyn eyed one for herself. They were crispy on the outside and warm and soft on the inside. Somehow, this meal felt like real food compared to everything else they'd eaten. It did her soul good to know that she'd helped. "We had a friendly cook when I was growing up. She was an older woman who didn't have any children of her own, and she doted on me a bit. I spent a lot of time in the kitchen. At first, it was just to avoid my mother. She wouldn't go anywhere near the place if she could help it. Eventually, it was because I liked it. Mrs. Cole taught me all sorts of things." "That sounds nice." It really was. It had been a while since she'd thought about old Mrs. Cole. There were so many fond memories in that kitchen, curled up by the stove on a cold day, or sitting in the kitchen and helping to make cookies whilst the snow fell past the window. "She showed me a lot of love." There must be something about cooks that makes them that way. She sounds a lot like ours was, Wade said softly as he broke the yolk on his egg and dipped his bread in it. There was a hint of a smile on his face, a look that Katelyn didn't think she'd seen yet. You had a cook? Though she wouldn't say it out loud, Wade hardly seemed like the kind who grew up in a house that would actually have staff. In fact, she wouldn't have been surprised if he'd told her he'd lived in the woods his entire life. His hands stilled as she could tell that he didn't like the question. He considered his plate, his tone gruff. Yes. Tell me about her. What was her name? It's not important. He shoved the last of the cake into his mouth and licked a bit of yolk off his finger. I'd like to know, she said. He'd been easier with her so far this morning, and she hadn't realized quite how much he'd opened up until now. No, my past is in the past. Downing the last bite of egg, he got to his feet and began cleaning up. We need to get on the road. Katelyn knew she should be absolutely desperate to reach Parkstown, but right now she was fighting the urge to grab the hem of his jacket and yank him back down into his seat. I think we can spare a couple of minutes. He ignored her, emptying the remainder of his tea into the fire. The smoke was thick, and she stared at him through the haze he'd created. Wade? What? Why won't you talk to me about her? I didn't even mean to say it. He threw his arms wide and then stomped over to the knapsack and began shoving things inside. Frowning, she rose. His jaw was clenched, his actions jerky. Is this the way you always are? She finally demanded. Do you treat everyone you know this way? Or is it just me? It was a question that had been burning through Katelyn's mind for a while now. She'd avoided it, not wanting to anger him, but they were beyond that now. If you don't like the way I am, then you're not alone. That doesn't mean I'm going to change. The past is none of your concern, so leave it be, Miss East Coast. You're being deliberately nasty now with the name-calling, she snapped. He dropped a pan into the bag with a resounding clash that spooked the horse. That's right. What did you call me? You're infuriating. That's what you are. Been called worse, he muttered, busying himself with packing things away. She glared at him from across the campfire, but of course, he didn't notice. The man hardly even knew how to have a conversation, let alone be aware of the nuances that came from living amongst decent people. You can stand there plotting, or you can help, he told her. She wanted to rile him, even a little bit. Anything that gets me back to society faster. If she was hoping for a reaction, she was disappointed. Take that down. He pointed at the shelter. While Wade worked on stripping meat from the boar, she turned her back on him and took down the shelter. She untied the ropes that held up the oilcloth that had kept them dry all night, pretending she didn't see all the careful patchwork that had been done to keep it in service. Then she rolled up the furs, not willing to think about what kindness he'd done for her, not only by providing shelter, but by making sure she felt safe. He was a complete brute, a wild man with no manners. He'd grown up in a house with a cook. She was vexed because she couldn't get a proper idea of just who he was. No more words were exchanged while they finished packing. It went quickly, and it was soon time to resume their journey. With a belligerent look on his face, Wade came around to her side of the cart and thrust his hand out into the air, offering it to assist her as he'd done all the other times. Right now, she didn't want his assistance. Katelyn dodged away from his hand and stepped closer to the cart. I can do it. When he stepped back to give her room, she put her foot on the top of the wheel and grabbed the side of the wagon bed. The wheel was too tall, and her efforts quickly failed. She shoved her foot between the spokes, only to squeak in pain when the tiny space pinched her. Katelyn attempted to pull her foot back out, but she jammed herself so thoroughly into the wheel that she could only hop backwards on one foot. She expected him to mock her when she nearly fell over backward. Instead, two big hands pressed gently against her back and brought her upright again. Wade reached forward and lifted her foot out from between the spokes, taking great care not to look backwards where her dress was in disarray. After these rather gallant actions, he again thrust his hand out in his silent insistence that he help her up. She glared into those brilliant blue eyes as she took his hand, grateful that this would be the last day she'd have to endure him. Chapter 8. The woods slowly faded into farmland, and a faint smudge on the horizon finally resolved itself into buildings. Parkstown. Katelyn was exhausted from the trip. Every bone and muscle in her body ached, and yet she felt a renewed sense of energy at knowing they were at last nearing their destination. She would no longer be stuck with this grouchy enigma trapper, and she could soon begin her new life with her husband. Katelyn would be freed of everything she'd left behind in Providence, and all would be well. Despite the dust that caked her face and the soreness in her back, she allowed herself a small smile. Wade didn't seem quite so excited. Sitting next to him on the board, it was impossible not to notice the way he stiffened as the town came into view. Katelyn had come to know the way he normally sat, with his back straight but his shoulders and elbows relaxed, letting the horse do the work instead of trying to control every slight turn of its head. He knew how to move with the jostling of the wagon so that it didn't jar him, but now it seemed as though he might vibrate right off the seat. "You can drop me off at the general store," she said, surprised at the pleasant tone in her voice despite how bitterly she'd felt toward him earlier that day. Mr. Nash had said I could send for him from there once the stagecoach reached town if he wasn't about. Wade's brows were already knitted together, but now they lowered over his eyes like thunderclouds. "I'll take you to his place." "But that's not the arrangement that he and I discussed in our letters," Katelyn protested, feeling her irritation come back swiftly. "It's not as though I have any idea where his ranch is anyway. I'd much rather not leave anything to chance." His jaw tightened as he gave her a quick sideways glare. "I promised you I'd deliver you, didn't I?" Katelyn couldn't remember ever getting quite this angry with someone in her life. Why did he have to be so stubborn? "But you said that you didn't know him, and I told you I don't know." "I know," he cut in. "I know where his ranch is. I'll take you there." Fine. It wasn't the arrangement, but Robson could hardly hold her at fault when she'd had so much difficulty merely in reaching Parkstown. She felt tension return to her body as they entered the town proper, immediately thinking back to the ruffians they'd left behind at that saloon where she'd first met Wade. But Parkstown was entirely different from that ramshackle little town. The town was certainly a little more organized, with half-timber-framed buildings sitting in neat lines alongside the road. Each building had signage announcing the owner's name and the purpose of the building. They passed by small corrals where horses waited, and other wagons had been parked at the side of the road. Respectable-looking ladies were out and about to do their errands, ushering their children along in front of them. A few of them even lifted their hands to wave politely at Wade as they drove by, and there were certainly a few curious stares. The blacksmith was out working in front of his shop. He lifted his hammer. "Wade, good to see you." Wade returned the greeting but didn't stop. "It seems you're rather well known here," Katelyn remarked quietly after several other people had hailed him too. He hunched his shoulder. "Does it? I meet a lot of people doing what I do." "I suppose so." It made sense, but it was hard to imagine a stubborn, grumpy man like Wade being acquainted with so many folks. Katelyn's brows climbed when two women with a parasol each, clad in frothy dresses, waved coquettishly at them. She looked harder at him. "Prosody rate." With the women's giggling filling her ears, she asked, "When were you last here?" He pulled a face. "A while ago." He turned north and headed back out of town. She glanced back at the receding buildings. "You're certain you know where we're going?" Katelyn almost demanded that he turn back. It would have been nice to stop in at the general store, or perhaps to find a place to clean up before she met her future husband. On the other hand, she was more than ready for this journey to be over with. "I'll leave you at the end of the drive," he said sullenly. "It's just over this hill." That will be fine. It would leave her to haul her luggage up to the house and then to hope that Mr. Nash was home. But that was all right. Katelyn had been through much worse at this point. They crested the hill and the ranch came into view. The house was set far back off the road, where the dust from passing travelers wouldn't settle in the yard. It was a simple but sturdy-looking home, with a chimney stack and several windows on the upper floor. It was bigger, grander than she was expecting, and she felt a rush of excitement. It could benefit from a woman's touch, she guessed. There were no flowers nor any drapes in the windows, but she could rectify that soon enough. Best of all, it had stone walls to keep all the critters out. Several outhouses clustered around it. The grounds were rolling, and she saw more houses in the distance. Long fence lines ran down on either side of the drive and along the road. Weeds grew up around them, nearly obscuring the posts in a few places. The driveway itself was pitted and rutted. Several men were gathered at the end of the drive, mending the fence. They glanced over their shoulders at the sound of the approaching cart, and one of them straightened. She heard the rush of Wade's deep sigh, just as the other man tipped back the brim of his hat and squinted, staring hard at the approaching travelers. One by one, the other men straightened, though it was the mustached man whose gaze was the hardest. The cart slowed, and Katelyn noticed that Wade's knuckles were white. They came to a stop. Wade held the other man's glare with his usual brusque manner. "Hello, Wade?" "Robson," Wade replied. Katelyn wanted to take her first good look at her husband-to-be, but instead swung a look of surprise at Wade. He'd intimated that he hadn't known her betrothed, but the way the contempt was rolling off them both told her a very different story indeed. "I didn't know you were in town," Robson said. "Just passing through." "You two know each other?" Katelyn waggled a finger between them both. Wade snorted derisively. "Not really." Robson Nash gave Wade a withering look before he whipped his hat from his head and took a step toward the cart. "You'll have to forgive him, miss. He doesn't have the good manners he was born with. My name is Robson Nash." He gave her a little bow. "It's very nice to meet you," she said politely. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here." Robson's heavy brows moved, and he tilted his head. "I don't follow." It was Wade who overrode her explanation. "If you'll allow me the honor?" "Robson Nash, this is Katelyn Scott." Katelyn waited for the glowering expression to fade from her betrothed's face, but it only darkened. He slapped his hat on his head and lifted a finger to Wade. "What's the meaning of this, Wade?" Wade lifted a hand and chuckled. "I was hired to do a job, and I did it." "Excuse me," Katelyn's voice cut between them both. "Mr. Nash, Robson swung his ferocity at her, and he roared. "And what the devil are you doing with my brother?" Chapter 9. "Your brother?" Wade at least had the good grace to face her, chagrined. "You told me you didn't know him." Katelyn divided a look between them. Whilst Wade was broad, Robson matched his height, though their coloring was different. She couldn't see any other similarities between them other than the animosity they shared for the other. Robson didn't reach out his hand to greet her, nor did he take a step forward. He angled his fists on his hips and glared from Wade to Katelyn and back again. Out of all the ways she'd imagined meeting her new husband, this wasn't it. Hostility crackled the air around her. "What's the meaning of this?" "I'm terribly sorry," Katelyn began. "I had no idea that Wade was related to you." "I don't want to hear from you," Robson snapped. "What are you doing with her, Wade? She's my bride, not yours." Katelyn's mouth fell open. "Now, listen here," Wade snorted. "Calm down, Robson. I'm here to make the delivery, that's all." "I told you that you're not welcome here." "I'm more than aware of that, and I have no intention of staying here," Wade said casually, though Katelyn could still sense that stiffness in his body. Katelyn hopped down out of the cart, not needing assistance, but she landed ungainly. She figured any type of explanation would be better coming from her. "My train broke down. I'm not sure if the news reached here." Robson's eyes narrowed even further. The long hours he worked in the sun had made his skin hard and leathery, emphasizing his displeasure as he scrutinized the newcomers. "That would explain why you didn't arrive on the train. I figured you were just like any other woman, promising one thing and then doing another." She felt the insult, even though she'd done nothing wrong. Why should he judge her when she'd only tried to do exactly as she'd promised? "The other passengers and I made it to a small town where we were to catch a stage, but it left without me. Wade was kind enough to bring me the rest of the way." She left out the part about the rogues at the saloon. She didn't think Robson was in the mood to hear about his brother's gallantry. "She needed rescuing," Wade told him, his tone cold. "She was stuck in Berryville. She was in a bind." Robson's stare stuck on Wade, somewhere over her shoulder. She moved stiffly forward toward her future husband, not only because of the long ride, but because of this strange revelation, and tried again to diffuse the situation. Did news about the train not reach you? I'd hoped it would. I'd have sent word ahead, but we were in the wilderness for days. Days? Robson repeated. He stuck out his finger, whisking it back and forth in the air to point at each of them in turn. You mean the two of you have been alone in the wilderness for days? The cart moved at her back, and Wade materialized at her side, even as Robson turned apoplectic. Nothing happened, Robson. There was no longer even a hint of the joy Katelyn had felt earlier. And I'm supposed to believe you, Wade? You sully everything you touch. Wade stepped up next to her. It was either that or leave her to try to make the rest of the trip on her own, with nobody to keep her safe. A city girl like her wouldn't have made it, and you know it. I know that you always want the things that I have, like my bride. Katelyn raised her hands, patting the air. Robson, please, I was desperate. Wade saved my life, Robson grunted. You always thought you knew best, didn't you, Wade? I did what needed to be done, Wade corrected. Robson's laugh was callous. I'm certain you did. And you, he swung to Katelyn. You think I want you after you're tainted? No bride of mine will have known the touch of another man. Wait just a minute, Katelyn exploded. How dare you insinuate that I'm anything other than proper? Robson's lips peeled back, his fists rolling into balls as he advanced on her. I don't believe you. Wade tucked her behind him. Go ahead, brother. Make one more move, and I'll take nothing but pleasure in teaching you the lesson that I should have given you years ago. Katelyn hid behind the vastness of Wade's shoulders, watching as Robson appeared to consider continuing with this madness, but it seemed that common sense won. You can help her find her way back to Rhode Island. She's not welcome here, and neither are you. Robson turned back to the fence. What do you mean? Katelyn asked. She already knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it straight from his lips. His shoulders sagged with irritation as he slowly turned again. I mean that our engagement is off. We won't be getting married, not after this. You can go on back to where you came from. Her lips tightened as she tried to hold herself together. Katelyn wanted to yell and scream at Robson, to remind him of all the trials and tribulations she'd had in order to get here, to get to him. He had no idea what it had cost her. It was true that something terrible would have happened to her if it hadn't been for Wade, and Robson ought to be thanking his brother, not threatening him. Trying to convince him of this, however, would only be a sign that she still wanted to marry him. After seeing those cold eyes and his arrogant nature, Katelyn didn't want anything to do with him. The only problem now was exactly where she was going to go. Chapter 10. They were well over the next hill before either one of them spoke. You're probably better off, Wade said gruffly. Robson would be a useless husband. Surprisingly, I agree with you. She admired the open prairies that tumbled away from them, the big open skies that were as intense a blue eyes that looked at her now. I'm sure you won't have any problem finding another husband, Wade continued. There are probably any number of men here in Parkstown, or I'm sure there are some back home too. I like to think most of them would be more understanding of your plight. The last thing I want to talk about is finding another husband, Wade. I had enough of those conversations with my mother. She didn't bother tempering her tone. Your last name is Nash? His gaze fixed ahead, though he nodded once. Her mind raced, recalling the times he'd had the opportunity to tell her the truth. I'm sorry, he said softly. He was no longer tense and rigid, but neither did he seem like his confident self. What are you apologizing for? He waited a beat. You had plans for your future, and it's because of me that they've gone awry. Katelyn scrubbed at her face, uncaring that it was messing up her hair. She was beyond caring about her appearance now. I think that once again you've saved me, Wade. Although this place is more beautiful than I could have imagined, he was not the man I thought he was. She took in those blazing blue eyes, the features that had become so familiar to her over the past few days. I might not even have had a future if it hadn't been for you. Yes, but maybe I could have found you a chaperone, Wade pointed out, scratching the back of his neck. Katelyn pulled in a deep breath. She knew she should be panicking right now, and yet she felt surprisingly calm. You've made it clear that you're a very resourceful man. If it'd been possible, then you would have made it happen. It's fine. I just can't help but feel guilty that you've no longer got a marriage lined up for yourself. I'm sure you're upset, and I'd like to make you feel better. Or maybe I'd like to make myself feel better. He looked away, then out over the fields that must be so familiar to him. I don't need you or anyone else to make me feel better. Katelyn had been so frustrated and angry with Wade so many times, but all of that fire had drained out of her. She felt better than she had since she'd been on the train, in fact. It isn't as though I was in love with Robson. It was an arrangement that I'd hoped would work out for both of us in a practical manner. I needed to get away from home because I wasn't going to let my mother and her new husband run or potentially ruin my life. At any rate, I'll figure something else out. He nodded, seeming to accept this for the moment. I don't need your apologies, Wade, but I think I do want an explanation, she decided a minute later. I think I deserve that. I told you I was coming to marry Robson. Why didn't you tell me he was your brother? One corner of his mouth twitched, and she thought that he was going to resort to his usual recalcitrant self. Just as she was firing up to demand an answer, he sighed. Robson and I haven't spoken in some time. As you can see, we don't exactly get along. None of that had anything to do with you, though. I thought it was best if you get a chance to form your own opinion. She blinked. What Wade had just said was simple enough, and yet it was unlike anything she was used to. Her mother was always claiming she knew best, insisting that Katelyn should let her make all the decisions. Nobody had ever wanted Katelyn to think for herself. It was a nice change. I believe I've done that. Robson had also made up his mind about her, and right on the spot. A man like that was no great loss, but it did leave open the question of what she was going to do with herself. She'd uprooted her entire life, and she'd said goodbye to everyone she loved. What would she do now? What happened between you? Did you ever get along as brothers? She asked, preferring to think about someone else's problems rather than her own. Wade's long silence stretched out. Finally, he lifted his chin a little bit. Our father claimed that land and turned it into what it is. When he passed on, Robson and I had a falling out. It was always his way. There was never any compromise with him, even if it turned out he was wrong. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life arguing with him. I stepped back from the ranch and went out to live off the land. The easier option, she murmured, echoing what he'd told her about his occupation before. I knew how. I spent a lot of my youth on the back acreage, where it hadn't yet been turned into cattle pastures. Though my father was an excellent rancher, it was only because of his own skill in the wilderness that he was able to take that piece of land and turn it into something civilized. He encouraged me, and it all worked out to my benefit. I might not look like it, but I do well. His cheeks flushed slightly with embarrassment. They entered Parkstown once again. It no longer felt as bright and welcoming as it had when they'd first arrived, but Katelyn knew that was only because of how much her life had changed in a matter of minutes. I can take you to the inn. There's a reputable one here, Wade said with a bit of a twinkle in his eye. I'll give you some money for room and board, so you'll have a safe place to stay until you can catch the stage and go back to Rhode Island. You don't have to do that, Katelyn began. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. His eyes dropped to his elbow, and she realized this was the first time she'd touched him outside of getting in and out of the cart. She quickly pulled her hand back. He cleared his throat. I've gotten you this far. I'm not going to just leave you here. But if there's a telegraph station, she reasoned, I can wire for money from my private bank account at home. You've already done so much for me. All right. His mood soured somewhat as they pulled up to the inn. Go ahead and make sure they have room for you before I leave. I will. Katelyn stepped up onto the porch and in the door. She suddenly felt as though she was transported back into the cultured world. A grand staircase rose up out of the lobby, and thick carpeting led up to the front desk. Off to her right, she spotted a large dining hall. Scents from the kitchen drifted out to greet her, and she thought instantly of a long bath and clean sheets. It was a simple enough matter to get a room, though Katelyn had worried that a wonderful place such as this might be full. When she stepped back outside, Wade was tending to the horse. Water dripped from the beast's lips, as he'd just given in a drink of water. Now he gently grazed his knuckles down the horse's blaze while he spoke softly to it, a low grumble that made the horse tip its head a little closer to him. This was a kind man, one who cared about those in need. Katelyn had been lucky when he'd come across her in a moment of such plight, and even more lucky that he'd helped her get to Parkstown. She didn't want to think about what would have happened to her otherwise, nor did she want to think about what she was going to do now without him. Can't? Katelyn stepped up to the wagon and lifted down her valise before he had a chance to do it himself. She hadn't thought it would be so, but leaving him was hard. She wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. My room is all ready. I must thank you again for everything you've done for me. You've been very kind. It was all she could say, though it didn't fully express her true gratitude. Will you be okay? She briefly met his keen gaze and pushed away the ache that thinking about not waking up to that brought about her. She nodded stiffly. Thank you, Wade, for everything. His lips twitched as though he held something back. He swallowed. Have you decided what you'll do? For the moment, I'll stay here for a few days. I've been on the road long enough, and I need some rest. Beyond that, I'm not sure. Katelyn tightened her fingers on the valise, realizing that all the manners she'd learned as a child didn't cover a parting quite like this one. You take good care of yourself, Katelyn. Wade touched the brim of his cap and got back into the wagon. Without looking back, she hurried up the steps and into the interior of the building. It was only when the door closed behind her that she realized that that was the first time he'd called her by her name. Chapter 11. Katelyn looked in the mirror as she arranged her dark locks. The inn was such a welcome respite. She'd soaked in the tub for as long as was feasible and washed every speck of dust out of her hair. Just having the chance to put on a clean dress was a very welcome change. She crossed to the window, looking down over Parkstown with its houses and businesses all clustered hopefully together, with people stopping to talk. It was almost as if the crazed wilderness experience that she'd had in getting her had all been a dream. It hadn't been, though. She remembered every bump in the road, every shiver at night, and of course, the sheer terror she'd felt when that wild boar had come charging at her. She tried in vain to keep her mind on the practicalities of making her travel arrangements and collecting her money. She'd even written to her mother to update her, neglecting to mention several things including the ruffians and spending the night tucked up alongside a trapper. If she'd had any reason to believe her journey west would consist of such things, she never would have come. At night, thought, her mind would betray her. Vibrant blue eyes and a sardonic smile drifted at the edges of her mind, and no matter how hard she tried, the man in her dreams stayed just out of reach. In the daylight, at least, she could focus on what she needed to. There were other things to remember, too. There was the way Wade had stepped in to save her from those awful men, even though he didn't know her from Eve. He'd kept her safe in the cabin, and he'd made sure she was fed. They were a challenge for each other. It was true, but he'd had her needs in mind right until the very end. She could still see those brilliant blue eyes focusing in on her, as though she was the only thing in the world. Stop that, Katelyn, she lectured herself. The stagecoach will be coming in a few days to take you back to Rhode Island. None of this will matter then. She turned from the window and put on her shoes before heading downstairs to eat, wishing she truly could forget about her upcoming journey back home. It would do her good to rest here for a while, but it would be difficult to trust that the stage and the train could get her all the way back to Rhode Island after what she'd been through. Then, of course, everyone who knew her would want an explanation of why she was back and what had happened with her marriage. There was also the matter of her mother. Would the Drysdales allow her to simply move back in as if nothing happened? Or would she need to strike out as a woman on her own, the gossip of Providence? There were too many unknowns, and no matter how hard she thought about them, she couldn't come up with any concrete plans. Somehow, going back home felt more uncertain than coming west ever had. "Ah, Miss Scott, I see you're looking very lovely this morning." Mrs. McDaniel waved her into the dining room and held out a chair for her at a table near the window. "I take it you're finding your room satisfactory?" "Oh, yes, certainly." At first, Katelyn had assumed that Mrs. Plink McDaniel was doting on her so much because she'd mentioned going to the telegraph office to wire for money. She was starting to realize, however, that the innkeeper was simply a friendly woman who was enjoying having someone else to chat with. "You have a very nice place here. In fact, I think I'll be sorry to leave it when I head back east in a few days." This brought an even bigger smile to Mrs. McDaniel's face. "That's so very kind of you to say. Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" Katelyn was in a strange town surrounded by strangers, and yet she felt so welcomed here that she hardly felt she could turn the woman down. Of course, glancing around the dining room and seeing that she wasn't needed at the moment, Mrs. McDaniel sat down at her table. "I'm not one for gossip, so I figured I'd come straight out and ask you. Someone said you were supposed to marry Robson Nash." Though Katelyn hadn't mentioned it herself, it didn't surprise her that the rumor was already making its way around the town. After all, several ranch hands had been right there on the Nash ranch to witness Robson turning her away. "That is true." "My goodness." Mrs. McDaniel sat back hard in her chair. "You've had a close one, then." "What do you mean?" The innkeeper glanced around again, this time so that nobody would hear her gossiping. "That Robson Nash wouldn't be the man I'd pick out for a sweet young lady like you." "No, miss." "I'm aware that there's a difference in our ages," Katelyn hedged, wondering if it was that or something else that Mrs. McDaniel was referring to. "It was an arrangement that we'd made without ever meeting, though he was honest with me about being older." It's not that." The older woman waved the thought away. "He's just not a very nice man. He treats people poorly, no matter what their circumstances might be. Why, just a few days ago he was in the general store. He gave Mr. Gout Hankins a full lecture about how he needed to stock better goods with a wider variety." Katelyn lifted her brows. She'd stopped in at the general store and had been quite pleased with what she'd found. It wasn't the same as being back home, but it was more than enough. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes, and if you'd had a chance to ask anyone about him as an employer, you never would have agreed to marry him. The man is incredibly stingy, paying his workers as little as he can get away with, and even that begrudgingly. It's not a very smart way to run a ranch that has plenty of work to be done." Mrs. McDaniel clucked her tongue. "Wade would have been a far better choice for the ranch, to be sure." Katelyn wondered if the part about her time with Wade had been made public as well, though at least Mrs. McDaniel hadn't mentioned it. "I understand the two of them don't get along very well." "To put it lightly," the innkeeper said with a loud laugh. "It's been years now since all that happened, though the two of them act as though it was yesterday." "And what did happen?" she dared to press. "Well, I don't like to gossip," Mrs. McDaniel quickly reminded her, "but it all started with their father died. I think old Mr. Nash had planned for the two boys to run the ranch together as a joint enterprise. It was big enough and successful enough. The two of them had very different ideas about how that should be done. Robson insisted he be in charge since he was the older brother. I don't think Wade would have minded that if Robson was at least willing to listen to him, but that man is as stubborn as a stone. He said it was his way or nothing else, so Wade left. It seems that he's successful enough as a trapper," Katelyn noted, though she didn't know much truth there was in that. A man who lived in the wilderness most of the time didn't live a comfortable life, but that didn't mean he wasn't making money. He certainly never went hungry. "He's a little bit more than a trapper," Mrs. McDaniel explained. "He makes his rounds, helping the older folks where he can. He refuses to accept payments in money, but will take things that these people can trade. He's regarded around here as a bit of a guardian angel to some. He owns a lot of land, some of which he's been left to by the folks that he's helped. But he won't settle," she said. Prosody and %. "It really is a shame that he's the one who has such a good head for business. The Nash ranch would look far different if he were the one in charge of it. None of this should matter to Katelyn. She'd be leaving in a few days, and she'd never see Wade, Robson, or anyone else from Parkstown again. Still, her curiosity was getting the better of her. What would it have been like? Well, he wouldn't have sold off large parcels of it to pay off debts, as Robson has done. I can safely tell you that much, Mrs. McDaniel guaranteed. There were a few matters to be settled after old Mr. Nash's death, and Robson decided to sell. He wasn't thinking about how much money those pieces of land would continue to make in the future. That was part of the problem. Wade didn't like to see all his father's hard work cut into pieces and sold off to the highest bidder. Something stabbed into Katelyn's heart at the mention of that. It wasn't entirely unlike her own situation. Her father had worked hard and watched every cent, but her mother had frittered it all away. It always made Katelyn wonder what her father would have thought if he could have seen what had happened to his estate now. Perhaps that was why she'd used her own funds as little as possible. That's very sad. Yes, but I can't say it's entirely unusual around here, Mrs. McDaniel admitted. People come west in search of their fortunes. They believe they can find a whole new life for themselves out here, that they can work the land the same way that others have. The hard work is important, but I think a little bit of luck and a lot of faith are part of it too. Many folks find that it's just too much for them. Katelyn frowned. It was no wonder that Wade felt so bitterly toward his brother. The innkeeper folded her hands on the table and sighed. Do forgive me for getting into your personal business. It's just that I'd heard word about you and Robson, and I wanted to know for myself. I thought you might be feeling poorly in knowing that he wouldn't marry you, but I say you've had a narrow escape. I'd better be getting back into the kitchen now, but I'll have your supper out to you in a moment. Thank you, and take your time. Katelyn turned to look out the window, a slightly different view from her room. If her train hadn't broken down, and if she hadn't been harassed, and if the stage hadn't left her behind, then she might never have met Wade. Nobody would have warned her what Robson was really like, and he'd simply have taken her off to the chapel as soon as she'd arrived before she'd had a chance to realize what a bad idea it was. The Lord worked in mysterious ways, and she liked to think he had some sort of plan for her. She only wished that she knew what it was. Chapter 12. Are you sure you don't need any assistance in getting to the station? Mrs. McDaniel asked for a third time. I can easily have Adam run your bag over to the station, so you don't have to carry it. He'll make sure it's all loaded up and everything. No, really, that's quite all right. Katelyn only had the one valise after all. She'd planned to send for the rest of her things once she was settled in Parkstown, but of course, that wasn't happening now. Mrs. McDaniel frowned as she handed Katelyn her receipt. I'm sorry to see you go, my dear. You've been wonderful company for me, and I think you're a delightful fit for our little community here. I know things didn't work out with Robson, the miserable thing, but I'm sure I could help you find another suitable husband. It really might be worth your while to stay around a little while. In fact, I could go right down the street and— No, Mrs. McDaniel. Katelyn didn't want to insist, but she could tell that the innkeeper was a force to be reckoned with when she was determined. Besides, she knew if she didn't leave now, then she might never do it. And then what would happen to her? Not that she hadn't considered the possibility of staying. She did have her inheritance to live off of, at least for a while, but she'd have to find some suitable form of employment. There weren't many opportunities for that here. I really do appreciate it, but I should go. Of course. You be careful, though, and send me a telegram when you're back in Rhode Island so I know that you've arrived safely. I'll do that, Katelyn promised. Thank you again for everything. Picking up her valise and having one last look, Katelyn stepped out onto the porch. She closed the door behind her and turned around to find a familiar face on the steps. Wade. Katelyn. He touched the brim of his cap. He'd remained clean-shaven, a look that suited him so much better than that bushy beard. I thought I'd come to see that you were doing well. Her stomach quivered, and she willed it to stop. I am, she said, holding on to her composure. In fact, I was just about to catch the stage. As long as it doesn't leave me this time, of course, she added with a small smile. Then we're both heading out of Parkstown, he concluded, studying her valise, her traveling gloves, and the hat she'd purchased at the general store for the trip. I'll be heading back out for a while, making my rounds through a few more towns where I've found some friendly trade. I would have thought you'd have been gone already, she admitted. She'd considered trying to find him several times in the past week or so. Katelyn told herself that this was only in order to give him some money as a full repayment for his escort through the wilderness. In her heart, she knew it was more than that. Now, with the way her jittery stomach was leaping inside her, she knew for sure that she'd fallen in love with him, just as she'd read about in her books. Mrs. McDaniel was right. There were other men to marry besides Robson, but she couldn't possibly live the same sort of life Wade did. It was painful for him to be here in town, considering all the memories it held for him. The whole situation was hopeless, wasn't it? Wade shrugged. There were a few things I had to see, too, first. New shoes for the horse, some repairs to the wagon, stocking up on supplies. I just wanted to make sure that you were doing well before I left. Thank you, that's very kind. The church bells struck the hour, reminding her that she had a schedule to attend to. I'd better go. Of course. He opened his mouth, about to say something else, but then he shook his head. Goodbye, Katelyn. Hearing her name on his lips felt like warm honey trickling over her, and she had to suppress the shiver. She felt foolish, swooning over him like a lovesick puppy. She firmed her mouth into a compressed smile. Goodbye. Wade turned and walked off in the opposite direction that Katelyn needed to walk. She supposed he had to go get his horse from the blacksmith or finish up the other errands he'd mentioned. It was strange to see him, all alone in the middle of the street like that. She wanted to call out to him, even if it was only so that he might turn to her for a moment and see her wave. No, she wanted it to be more than that, but it couldn't be. Just as she was about to turn toward the station, she spotted a rider barreling through town. He was heading straight for Wade. A bolt of fear passed through her as she wondered what this was about and if Wade might be in danger. But the man called out to Wade. She saw the trapper turn, and the rider leaned down as the two of them held an urgent conversation. Something was wrong. She could see it in the way Wade's shoulders stiffened, and she could feel it inside her. That feeling was confirmed when Wade hurried off at a much faster pace. The rider turned and came up the road toward the inn, this time at a more casual pace. Katelyn lifted her hand to him, grateful when he stopped. She recognized him as Nathan, one of the young men who worked at the general store. What's the matter? Well, ma'am. He jerked his hat off his head as though he'd suddenly realized he was being impolite. I had the unfortunate duty of telling Wade that his brother's been bitten by a copperhead snake. He was out trying to clear a part of the pasture that he'd let get overgrown, and it got him clean on his leg. Oh my, Katelyn didn't care for the man, but that didn't mean she wished him ill. Is he going to be all right? Nathan looked over his shoulder in the direction Wade had gone and then back at her. I'm afraid not, ma'am. Robson has already passed on, without even a chance for the preacher to give him his last rites. Oh gosh, that's dreadful, she said, surprised at herself for being so overwhelmed by the news. Robson hadn't become her husband, but she had once imagined a life with him, and she didn't wish him any ill will. She pressed her fingers to her throat. She glanced back along the road. Wade could no longer be seen, and she had no idea where he'd gone. His brother was dead, and he'd died quickly enough that there hadn't even been a chance for the two of them to clear the air. She reminded herself that she had a stage to catch. If you'll pardon me, I've got to go talk to the undertaker. Nathan put his hat back on with a polite nod and rode off. She watched as he trotted away. She struck out along the road toward where she was meeting the stagecoach, though her steps faltered, and she stopped. Wade wasn't her concern, not really. She didn't know what she could possibly do for Wade, and yet she knew she couldn't leave. He'd helped her in a time of great need, and she wanted the chance to do the same in return. With a final burst of resolve, Katelyn marched back up the steps and into the inn. Katelyn, Mrs. McDaniel exclaimed. "Did you forget something, dear? Change your mind about the valise?" "I believe I've changed my mind about the trip," she replied honestly, "at least for the moment. I don't suppose I could rent my room for a few more days?" The innkeeper's broad face split into a wide grin. "Of course, you can, of course. Let me just get Adam to get your bag. Adam!" Because it seemed to mean so much to her. Katelyn didn't stop her. She headed back up the stairs to her room, thinking about the next couple of days. Wade didn't need her, necessarily, and she was probably the last person he wanted to see just now, but she could at least stay around and make sure he was all right. Chapter 13. 3 days had passed, and Katelyn hadn't seen Wade once. She knew via the reliably circulated stories from Mrs. McDaniel and her cohort that Wade was at the ranch, trying to deal with the fallout of the mess his brother had made of the ranch. More than once, she'd thought about visiting him to offer her condolences. Going to him was what a friend would do, wasn't it? Although Katelyn wasn't sure if they could be termed as friends. In all honesty, she didn't know exactly what the two of them were. What did one term a man whom she'd met and spent 2 days with, argued with, and slept alongside? Wade hadn't once been improper toward her, but neither had he implied that he needed anything from her either. She'd already ruined her reputation, at least in Robson's and her mother's eyes, even though she'd done nothing wrong. In that sense, there was nothing for her to lose. And yet, she knew that she couldn't interfere with his life any more than she already had. She'd simply hoped she'd see him around town long enough to tell him she was sorry for his loss. In the end, she'd decided that her presence would be a nuisance. She'd allowed herself these few extra days, but there was no hiding from it now. She'd already made the decision to go back, and now she must. Was Wade even grieving his brother? He had enough to deal with, without the added baggage of the late Robson's fiance complicating things. Katelyn had bid her farewell to Mrs. McDaniel and Adam, and was whiling away the time watching the passengers and staff deal with stagecoaches passing through Parkstown. The passengers were quickly getting unloaded. It wouldn't be long before Katelyn's bags would be loaded up, and she'd be seated, on her way to the closest train station, and then back to Rhode Island. "Welcome back to Parkstown, Mrs. Cobb," the station master said to an older woman as he helped her down from the arriving coach. "I hope your daughter is doing well." "Thank you so much, Charles." Mrs. Cobb was a woman about 20 years Katelyn's senior, and though Charles handed her carefully down from the coach, she seemed quite spry. "Christine is doing wonderfully. She delivered a perfectly healthy baby boy. He's such a doll, and I could have stayed in Topeka for another couple of months if I thought I had the time. I imagine Mr. Cobb wants me back, though, unless he's been having too much fun without me." She laughed as she straightened her bonnet and shook out her skirts. Charles tipped his head thoughtfully. "I do think I saw him playing poker at the saloon." "Good. Then he got all of that out of his system, and he's ready for me to start nagging him again." The two of them shared another laugh. "Has there been any big news here since I've been gone?" "Well, yes. Robson Nash passed away," the station manager told her. "A snake bit him." Katelyn wondered if the two of them had any idea that she was listening, although they weren't trying to keep their conversation private. Nothing, she supposed, was all that private in a small, close-knit town like this. She turned away, knowing she shouldn't be eavesdropping. "Is that so? An ill-natured old man like he is? I thought he might live forever. What's happening to the ranch? I suppose the last of it'll be sold just like the rest." Charles tucked her arm into the crook of his elbow and took her bag in his free hand as he walked her away from the coach. "You'd never believe it, but Wade has taken over." "You're right. I don't believe it. We all thought maybe he was just settling the estate and then he'd head out for the woods again, but he's staying. I heard him down at the newspaper office just this morning, asking to put in advertisements for more ranch hands and a cook. Someone else mentioned he was interested in buying back some of the land his brother had sold off, although I don't know for sure if that's true," Charles admitted. "Remarkable," Mrs. Cobb enthused. "I still wouldn't believe it if you hadn't told me yourself." Katelyn had to agree. Wade had been so sour about the ranch and how his brother had cared for it, a story she'd pieced together from what Wade had told her and the details that Mrs. McDaniel had filled in. Did that mean he was going to stay in one place? Surely that couldn't make him happy after living off the land for so long. "There he is now, so you can ask him," Charles replied. "I wouldn't dare." Katelyn turned, and sure enough, she saw Wade himself walking down the street. He looked different, somehow, and not in the way she'd imagined. Katelyn had worried that he'd be dragged down by having to abandon his trapping business while he took care of whatever troubles his brother had left for him. After all, he seemed like a man who wanted only to get back out into the hills and leave it all behind him. He looked different to her, lighter, happier. Perhaps it was his clothing. He wore a soft-looking shirt and cotton pants. His shoulders were straight but not tense, and he allowed himself a small smile as he waved at someone across the street. As though he sensed her looking at him, Wade turned and met her gaze. His eyes were still that intense blue, but there was a softness to them that she wasn't used to. He angled his steps, coming her way. She felt her chest tighten and her heart lift. She'd wanted to see him so badly. How could she possibly explain to him why she was still here, and why she hadn't come to see him, or at least sent word? Now she knew she'd done nothing but make another mistake. "Miss Scott," he lifted his hat to her, a smile playing around the edges of his mouth as the wind tousled the edges of his dark hair. His new presence suited him. "It's good to see you, but what are you doing here?" Katelyn's eyes roved over him, and she felt her cheeks reddening when he raised a brow at her. She tried to gather her errant thoughts, though only the truth sprung to her lips. "I couldn't leave," she admitted. "I'd heard about your brother, and I was worried for you. I know there was nothing I could truly do to help Wade, and I'm so sorry that all of this happened." There was that smile again. It wasn't a broad grin, just a hint at the corners of his mouth, and yet it managed to change his entire look and chivvy her heart about in her chest. "What should you be sorry for?" "For your brother's death," she began. "For not coming to see you. I just didn't know how." She was aware that Charles and Mrs. Cobb were watching them, which made this even harder. "It's just as well that you didn't," he told her kindly. "There was much to be done, and I'm afraid I wasn't very polite to those who came to give their condolences. I've apologized for that, but I felt as though the world had fallen on my shoulders." "Oh, Wade," she whispered, feeling that he deserved that least of all. He shook his head. "No. It's all right. I've managed to settle things fairly quickly. As many complaints as I could give you about my brother. May he rest in peace. He did keep good records. That included records of his mistakes, which I'm working on fixing. Would you like to come to the ranch with me to see what I've done?" Her eyes flicked to the coach. The horses were being changed, and the passengers were eagerly waiting for their chance to get the best seats. Her plans had been changing constantly, ever since that train had broken down. She'd already stayed in Parkstown longer than she'd meant to, and she'd once again bid a tearful Mrs. McDaniel goodbye. She was bound for Rhode Island, for an uncomfortable discussion with her mother and stepfather, for a life in which she'd have to figure out how to strike out on her own. That wasn't what she really wanted. Not in her heart. Katelyn only wanted to spend more time with Wade. It would be another few days before the coach was available again, and she adjusted her grip on the handle of her valise. "Yes, thank you. That would be nice." The two of them walked a short way to his cart, which was no longer full of furs but of various other supplies that he'd picked up in town. She spotted tools, sacks of seeds, and planks of wood from the timber mill. "I can see already that you've been busy." He assisted her hand and tossed her valise into the bed of the cart before he climbed up beside her. Neither of them noticed the looks from the townsfolk as Wade clicked his tongue, his eyes resting on his pretty passenger. The horse picked up the pace once it knew it was headed for home, and Wade gave him his head. Wade gave her a brief rundown of the past week or so, from managing the ranch hands to studying the books and liaising with local businesses who were all clamoring for the monies owed to them by Robson. "It's been nice to have the work. To be honest with you, it's kept my mind busy." Your brother's death must have been difficult for you, she said quietly. It was, he admitted. It still is. I wish things hadn't gone the way they did. I'd have much preferred for the two of us to get along, to run the ranch together the way my father had intended. Robson never would have allowed it, and I have to give myself grace in knowing that I reached out to him numerous times to try to mend things between us. I know you were a witness to that last encounter, but that was calm compared to all the other times I tried to talk to him. I see. She realized she'd been worried that her time with Wade had been the final straw between the two of them, and a bit of relief released her shoulders. I don't like knowing that my relationship with him had turned out that way, and Robson wouldn't have admitted that he missed me. Horace, the chief ranch hand, told me that Robson's last words were of me. He regretted everything he'd done, and he said he knew the place would be in good hands now. His expression had turned slightly sorrowful, but he shook it off. I'm sure that's the closest he'd ever come to admitting that the ranch had fallen into such disrepair. Robson didn't like to think that anything was his fault, but now I finally have the chance to make it better. You'll see for yourself. The cart crested the hill, and Katelyn looked to her right. Her eyes widened as she took it all in. She'd only seen it for a brief time when she'd first arrived in Parkstown, but it was easy to spot the difference. The weeds around the fence posts had been cut back, and multiple repairs had been made to the fence itself. Gravel and rocks had been hauled up from a creek bed somewhere to fill in the ruts in the driveway. Though the house could still use some paint and flowers, someone was busy repairing a portion of the sagging roofline on the front corner. Wade, it's incredible, he laughed. You haven't even seen all of it, nor have you seen everything I plan to do. I did hear some folks at the station talking about just that, she admitted. It seems you're the talk of the town at the moment. His face blemished slightly. For me, it's not about how it looks to anyone else. I've never cared about that. You know, it's about honoring my father's legacy and carrying it on as best I can. There were so many things I always wanted to do with the ranch, and it's going to be a long process. Wade had turned up the drive, which rolled smoothly under their wheels. He pulled up in front of the barn, where several broken planks of wood were being pulled down by a couple of the hands. Here's the lumber you were needing, he called to one of the men. Thanks, boss. A ranch hand ambled out and reached for the horse. I'll get him put up for you. You don't have to do that, Wade replied. The hand's eyes flicked to Katelyn. You've got company. I'll get this. All right. He got down and helped Katelyn to the ground, smiling warmly over his shoulder at his employees. They're too nice to me sometimes. I'm sure it has something to do with their increased salaries, but they'll probably get tired of me eventually. Come on inside. Katelyn followed him into the house. She hadn't quite known what to expect, but she was surprised at the spaciousness of it all. Wade had been content to stay in a tiny one-room cabin in the middle of the woods when she'd first met him, and yet here was a beautiful home with hardwood floors, big windows, and beautiful, sturdy-looking furniture that gleamed. There's still plenty of work to be done, Wade said apologetically as they stepped into the kitchen. It was large and well-appointed, but the paint was peeling, and water had damaged a corner of the floor at some point. I've been spending any spare time I have making lists of what else I need to do and how I'm going to achieve it all. Hiring more staff is the beginning of it, as well as making sure those who already work for you get paid, Katelyn noted. Even with such a short interaction, she could see that the hands here were already much happier than when they'd worked for Robson. Given what Mrs. McDaniel had told her about the older man, it was a surprise that anyone had stayed under his employ at all. Yes. Wade picked up a cast-iron skillet that sat on the stove and tested the weight of it in his hands. You know, I remember some very good cornmeal cakes that you made while we were on the trail. She smiled at him, the memory a warm and happy one, despite the danger and worry that surrounded the situation. You only thought they were good because there wasn't anything else worth eating. No, I'm pretty sure that's not the case. It takes someone with a lot of skill and quick thinking to do something like that. He set the skillet back down and met her with that incandescent stare of his again, although there was a softness behind it. "I'm looking to hire a cook." She swallowed. Was he offering her a job? Was that something she could even contemplate? Her mind raced as she examined the problem from all sides. A job here at the Nash Ranch would mean she could stay here and start her new life, which was the only thing she'd really wanted when she'd agreed to marry Robson. It wouldn't be easy if she knew Wade was going to be around, since he made her feel things that a cook certainly shouldn't feel for her employer. However, there was nothing that had gone the way it was supposed to since she'd left Providence. Perhaps this was what the Lord had planned for her that she was still trying to understand, that she'd been fighting against too hard to see. "Are you?" "Yes, I've put an advert in the newspaper, but I'd be happy to cancel it and hire you instead. It comes with room and board." He put his hands behind his back and watched her expectantly. Katelyn had been worrying herself sick over the last week or so, and in fact probably even longer than that. A better opportunity wasn't likely to ever be thrown into her lap. "I'll do it." Chapter 14. Hoo boy, that is something else. Horace pushed his chair back from the table and patted his stomach. "Miss Scott, there are a lot of wonderful things that Wade has done for this ranch, but the best thing he ever did was to hire you as a cook." "I'm glad you think so," Katelyn said with a little laugh. She'd been at the Nash Ranch for 2 weeks now and still felt as though she was trying to find her footing. Fortunately, all the other workers here had welcomed her with open arms and hungry bellies. She liked knowing that she was doing something good, that she was helping with something instead of just rattling around in a big house in the city, waiting for something to happen. "Speaking of your employer, have you seen him? It's not like Wade to skip dinner." She eyed his empty chair. He'd sent the other hands-on in with word not to wait for him. Katelyn had assumed at first that he was just overworking himself, insisting that he get done with a project before he allowed himself the pleasure of a meal break. He still hadn't shown up yet, and it bothered her. Horace shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine. I last saw him out by the barn, but there's no telling at this point. He's been a bit distracted lately." "Do you think anything is the matter?" She noticed a couple of the other hands exchange a look and wondered what they knew. The chief ranch hand rolled his eyes up toward the ceiling. "I don't think anything is the matter. No, I think he's just been real deep in thought lately. You know, making big decisions." "Oh, all right. Does anybody want dessert?" She stepped back into the kitchen to fetch the walnut cake that she'd made. Katelyn knew Horace wanted her to think those big decisions Wade was contemplating were about the future of the ranch, but she had a distinct feeling they were keeping something from her. What could it possibly be? She knew all about Robson's old gambling debts and how Wade was negotiating to buy the land back that he'd sold off. Wade talked often and thoroughly about every detail, from selling the cattle to buying seed to expanding the vegetable garden. Something else was happening, and it worried her. She cut generous slices of cake, hoping it wasn't anything that would mean the end of her time here. She'd come to love the Nash Ranch and the people on it. There were certain feelings she had for Wade as well, but she'd kept them to herself. It wouldn't do to say anything now, not when he'd been so generous to her and had invited her into his home. Katelyn tried to put it out of her mind as she carried the cake out to the table, but it wasn't working. "Excuse me, boys." It was time for some fresh air, and her favorite time to get outside was always sunset. She loved watching the orb of the sun turn into liquid gold as it melted toward the horizon, sending bursts of colors through the sky and reminding her of just how majestic this part of the world truly was. Katelyn often came out here alone, just to have a few moments to collect her thoughts and reflect on her gratitude. Only she wasn't alone today. Wade stood there, his elbows on the railing, the amber light of the sunset on his face. He turned as she stepped up next to him. "It's a beautiful evening." "Is that why you didn't come in to eat?" she teased, hoping the light mood would get him to talk. If something was wrong, then she wanted to know. The urge to fix whatever might be wrong had taken over her, and she wasn't going to shake it until she got to the bottom of this. No. He smiled a little as he looked out across the pasture. I've just been thinking. I've heard. She hoped she wasn't violating any trust between Wade and his workers by saying so. I know there's a lot to be done when running a place like this. There is, he admitted, but it's not about the ranch, or at least not directly. It's more about me, about my future. He had a way of making her worry, and her mind raced. Was he already done with ranch life, ready to call it quits and return to the life of a trapper? What about it? She asked innocently. Wade, in his customary fashion of thinking for a while before he answered, was silent. Finally, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out something small and shining with gold. He handed it to her. I've been meaning to give this back to you. My grandmother's brooch. She ran her hand over the fine carving of the cameo. A rush of emotion filled her and made her eyes sting a little. You still have it. I thought it would have been long gone. Wade, you can't give this back. It was your payment for... I know. He folded her fingers around it as she tried to give it back to him. I can't take a payment for something I'd so gladly have done for free. I thought about giving it back to you once we reached Parkstown, and you were supposed to go back to Rhode Island, but I didn't. I didn't sell it either, even though I know it would have fetched much more than a ride in a dusty old cart. Why not? She held her breath, hoping. Wade swallowed. The truth is that I wanted to keep it as a reminder of you, as a token of something that I didn't want to forget. The brooch was heavy in her hand as she looked into his eyes. And what does it mean if you're giving it back to me? He turned to her, resting his hands gently on her elbows. Katelyn, I've never met anyone that made me feel the way you do. I didn't quite know how to feel about it at first, because you were supposed to be marrying my brother. All of that made things so complicated, but I want it to be simple now. I'm giving you back that brooch because I'm hoping I won't need to have a reminder of you anymore. I'm hoping you do me the great honor of becoming my wife. Katelyn gasped, her breath sucking into her throat and getting stuck for a moment. She'd allowed herself to think about just such a thing, though she hadn't believed it might be real. Fate had put the two of them together, and she'd contented herself with thinking that serving as his cook would be as close to Wade as she would ever get. He swam through the tears that filled her eyes, hope and joy bursting in her heart. Truly? He ran his hand down the side of his face and cupped her jaw in those strong fingers. Truly. I love you, Katelyn. I don't want to live my life without you. You're an excellent cook, granted, but I want much more from you. I want to give you my heart and have you by my side every night until my last one. Standing there in the gorgeous Kansas sunset, Katelyn didn't know how she'd ever managed to be so lucky. There were so many events that had led her here, and she knew it was meant to be. Wade closed the gap between their bodies. What do you say, Miss East Coast? I say yes to you, Wade. Yes to all of it, because I love you too. The end.